I was just rereading this to get ready for Rick, and I said, self-interest.
Ding, ding,
That
ding,
word,
ding,
that's
ding.
a trigger word for Kenneth.
Yeah, I'm afraid under the new political circumstances that have been growing over the years, these works will be banned.
Uh, if I felt that the new administration could read these documents, I would share your fear. But, but I'm not sure they'll read them, or having read them, think about how threatening they could be.
Yeah.
But
Philosophy. Kenneth, Donald, how often does Kenneth say philosophy in the modern world is really impotent? Because modernity has such contempt for it, no interest in it.
Oh, well, might go up in popularity. Somebody told me in Soviet Russia, the biggest thing was reading forbidden books and, sitting around the table, a few Russians.
Yeah. I'll never forget the cab ride I had in San Francisco with the Russian cabbie who expressed his bewilderment at Americans. He says, in Russia, we knew the government was lying to us. We fought like crazy to get our hands on the real information. He says, here in the US, you're swimming in information. They don't even bother to hide it most of the time. Just put it out in the open because they know Americans don't care and aren't going to look. It's like, you can use the Freedom of Information Act to ask all kinds of questions about what the government's been up to. Hardly anyone ever does. And when they discover heinous things that our government has done, mostly they can't find an audience. No one cares.
so, Rick, in last Friday's Wall Street Journal,
Ooh.
there was an article, that's an opinion piece on are we returning to great power politics? Is the New World Order breaking down to be just the old world order of great powers? And in the
Mhm.
second paragraph, there occurs the following sentence: the strong do as they please, and the weak suffer as they must.
That's Julius Caesar.
That's
Thucydides.
Thucydides. It's
Thucydides.
Oh,
Thucydides
no. Oh, sorry.
recording what the Athenians, the message they sent to Melos, to the Milesians,
Millions.
you know. And it's not even quoted or given with a citation. But in this case, I think it's assumed that the reader knows the source,
Yes.
you know. But I'm just, it's just, I'm just reading this article, and all of a sudden, Thucydides leaping out from a newspaper. How dare they?
Yeah, I remember it
Yes.
used to be in a computer game all the time. They used to have quotes from the period playing this Roman war game.
Really?
Yeah, Rome Total War. Yeah, there's a whole loading screen quotes they called it.
Oh,
Oh, I'll
nice.
put it in the chat.
Yeah, yeah. That's nice. Littering it with classical quotes. I love it.
Are we
Okay.
really talking about Rome Total War, the video game? That is something I used to
Yes.
be heavily addicted to. Very
Ah,
excellent real-time strategy video game. Amazing.
yeah. And evidently loading screen quotes from classical antiquity, right?
Yeah, the loading screen quotes are fantastic. They have a lot of them. Really,
Yeah.
really good stuff.
Nice. Phil, you got your hand up. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I have something that relates to this because it seems like, I've been studying the Republic and finished with that. Uh, have a reasonable understanding of what's being done there. And now I'm in a meetup with about the law of Plato. And I was surprised. Well, I wasn't surprised in the first part because I asked somebody who's really in this Greek scholarship in this meetup. I said, you know, say something about Plato and the Republic and the laws. And he said, well, not enough people understand that Plato modeled the Republic after Sparta because he was rich and he didn't like the democratic ideals. So okay, that sounds reasonable, like because they fail and he was rich and he decided the poor people didn't understand what the hell's going on, so democracy was not going to be the thing. So the hierarchy of structure wasn't important. But I was actually surprised at his response to the laws. He says the laws was actually modeled after Persia. You know, the Persian culture, because it was about statecraft, because that was happened in Crete, which means that in some sense you're dealing with the harmony of not only in your soul, but in the family, and then in your society. I mean, your regional society, and then the nation, and then the other, which is where statecraft comes in, and uh, the contest of great powers, diplomacy, and and of course war. So that seemed interesting. And when he said that, I said, "Wow, maybe that's true." In order to deal with the other nations, the otherness, because they're not part of the family, even in the broadest sense. I mean, you want to have the statecraft to deal with them in negotiation and diplomacy and all that kind of stuff before war, and then you have to back it up with the threat of war. So that's a great power struggle that seems like we're moving into with the breakdown of the world order, and seems like it's become very intense again in the Middle East, but certainly Ukraine and Russia, and South China Sea. So that seemed to relate to what was brought up, that the statecraft, a great power of conflicts, is in fact something that happened with the relationship of empires in Persia, and that relationship between countries, and it's happening now. So things change, but they never really change. So that's interesting.
Well, if you look at history, you see that pattern of just the past 500 years. World trading empires, period of warfare where they try to sort out who's top dog, a period of relative peace when the great powers don't fight each other, and then they go back to it again. So when we were living in this period of peace, studying history, I knew trouble was going to brew eventually.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's because we really don't, have a single family. We really do have the others. uh, and in some sense, when you have a global trade, it seemed like it could evolve into a, a global order, but it didn't happen. So too many ideologies. So
Thank you for that, Phil. Before we get much further, I actually want to check in with Sharon and Geneva because you guys weren't here last week and I missed you. We all missed you. Wanted to see how you were doing, make sure you're both okay.
Yep, I'm okay, thank you. Missed you guys too. Yeah, it's so cold here. Yeah, I'm not used to this. It's like sub-zero temperatures.
Woo!
But
Yeah.
thank you.
Where
Yeah,
where is here? Where is here, Geneva?
I'm in St. Louis, but I just moved here from LA, so
Ah,
drastically different.
There
Yeah.
are better ways
huge.
to avoid the fires than
Yeah,
going to St. Louis.
I know.
true, true. Here we like just tread through the snow and ice. Yeah,
So you move from the hot zone to the cold zone. I don't know which
true.
is better. Why don't you
I
go to
know.
Kansas, somewhere in the middle?
Yeah. Thank
about
you
you?
though for asking. I appreciate it. Yeah, missed you guys too. Yeah.
Thanks, Geneva.
Now, I thought we didn't have a meeting last week.
Ah,
Ah,
Did we on the 13th, or did we have it on the 14th?
we met last week.
Which
We-
day?
On the Monday. Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh,
So it'll be on David's YouTube channel if you want to check it out.
okay.
Um, and we basically did we'd already done paragraph 9 the week before when you were here. We kind of briefly went back through it in order to set up paragraph 10, and we went through paragraph 10 last week. So you would have been proud of us. We did the text, but I actually have ulterior plans this week in partly in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and partly because I wanted to, and I said last week I was going to do this. I wanted to draw attention to an aspect of the medieval revolution that is right here in paragraph 10, but it's implicit rather than explicit. So after we get through the initial questions and comments, I'm gonna basically take us away from the text in order to add some supporting foundation under the text. But first let's do comments. So Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
I'll start with the typical. This is a very big highlight of my week, and I'm very happy to share this time with everyone and learn. This is what I like to fantasize, is how the world will get better by if all the people in the world were to have groups like this and to start to discuss in a robust way how we can access things like Sophro Sune, or whatever similar concepts are out there. We're going to be redirecting ourselves to steering the car of the world a lot better. So I'm very thankful and grateful to all of y'all, and specifically Rick, for making this happen. I guess for David, I don't want to forget David. He's kind of like the silent, hidden version of things. So I want to make sure he's very much recognized. And specifically, my thought goes to an interesting, he's going to be a source I use more often. Again, something I talked about before, he's kind of my infatuation of a source of a great scholarship, which is Jonathan Sacks, the rabbi from the Commonwealth of England for many years, passed away. He was also Lord, he was also knighted, but he brings together a really different array of science and history and religion, and tries to take a much more egalitarian stance. Specifically, his book that I just read this week, I just chowed through it, was Not in God's Name, and it talks about religion as a general idea. And it's very much like Will Durant talking about how religion is kind of like the protection of a society, or you would say more, we use in this language, in this group, like a common mythology, or a shared morality, or in this case, a specific ethic that everyone can rely on, that help each other build a shared future where it accommodates and modulates and regulates the natural hierarchies and entropy that we experience. One of the points that he points out as a big signature to when cultures fail, like Will Durant, is when religion is abandoned, and the previous mythos, like in the ancient time, when the ancient period is transitioning to the medieval, we're seeing them abandon basically their beliefs in all of their religious or mythological structures. And he ties it to a strange thing that when you have these, as I think Donald will point out, that we have, and really Stephen as well, there's this relationship between affluence and power, and then we get rigid. He points out specifically when this happens, when a religion is lost, that you see a massive drop in the population's replenishment rate, meaning the wealthy stop making a lot of children. And this is clearly in our time. Europe has like a replenish rate of, you have to have a societal replenish rate of like 2.2. Europe's at like 1.4, and Korea and Japan are like devastatingly like 1.2. And the US for a long time having theoretically more religious people, or maybe more immigrants that are still new, had a higher replenish rate, but now it's closer to like 1.7, 1.8. And you see just from a simple like math that a society cannot sustain itself. You cannot have the old mythos and culture be a backbone when the people are literally not breeding anymore. And you have to rely on immigrants or slaves, or think of in the Roman time, to keep your society functionally going as an economic powerhouse. And I'm just curious if, I don't think we talked about it here, but I'm curious if Kenneth brings up, or if he doesn't, if we want to introduce an element of like almost like physical biology here of, is there a relationship between these movements, these epochs being, almost like an organism that's growing and sustaining, like a child that has the ability to produce a lot more, metastasize a lot more cells, really make more mitosis, grow, versus and have neuroplasticity and this ability to do things. That's requiring developing new cells. That's effectively having more babies, right? But an old person stops being able to do this. And I'm thinking the equating of an epoch like a person, like an organism, it stops replenishing itself physically through birth. And it's a strange, mysterious phenomenon that you see here, that when people have a lot of wealth, it's like too difficult or too much of a burden to have children anymore. And I'm wondering if he or anybody talks about this, because specifically you also see there's a big problem moving forward for Sufarsune in our world, is the liberal democracy of all the people that are wise and educated are not really breeding or procreating, or generally, but then you have a lot of religious people who are. So the religious people are going to inherit the world, and you're going to have places like, in the Middle East or all these other places that you might see where religion is really strong, and maybe religious violence or religious societies, they're making a lot of babies. But in the West, where the West seems to be failing, one of the big problems is we're not making babies anymore. And I'm not talking about
5 minutes, sorry.
Okay, thank you. That was probably enough. So my question is really about the population and what is the relationship between demographic replacement rates and this ability to have an epoch, transition or sustain itself or grow. This is where I'm thinking.
Thank you, Ari. I see that Sharon would like to say something about that. Go ahead, Sharon. Come off mute.
Answer that very briefly. Education of women. When women get educated, the birth rate goes down. I don't know all that complexity that Ari's talking about, but if you look at it, for my own example, my grandmother had 12 children. All her daughters get educated and nobody had more than 3.
Mm-hmm.
I got really educated, I had 1.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, when women get educated, I don't know about religion and all that other complexity, but it definitely has to do with the economic advantages of women and the birth rate. That's it, simply. Thank you.
And I've heard that one before too. There have been some interesting studies on that. Show that it's been summarized sometimes by people saying, that in America people complain about the teen pregnancy rate, and people offer all kinds of crazy solutions to solve the teen pregnancy problem in America, but hardly anyone politically notes what you just described, Sharon. Scientists are always trying to bring it up, and then it doesn't make its way into our political discussion at all, which is funny. But I mean, I've heard it as people attempt to turn it into a slogan that you could get people to latch onto politically. I've heard it summarized as the best form of birth control is education.
Yes. Well, and that is why in the last political campaign, we had things like childless cat ladies, and the attempt to return the women to the kitchen. I mean, I think that the Republican response to one of the State of the Union was a female Republican sitting in her kitchen. I flipped up. I thought, wow. Because there's a direct relationship between education. Most of my colleagues, they have 1, maybe 2 children. Most of us have 1.
Yeah.
And it's the amount of time the education takes.
Yeah.
The prejudice in the workplace, the childbearing, it's getting a whole lot less now. But in my generation, it was awful. When I was pregnant, I was sick for 4 months. It was a big deal. It was an all-male practice.
Yes.
So that's what it is. That's why the birth, and I know right then and there, I'm not having any more.
Yeah. Yeah.
Can we take this back to Kenneth and what we're talking about? Do you think, can we hypothesize or even have any evidence rather than just speculation that any of this sort of education, does this translate to what was happening in the ancient or medieval time? Was there any education of women at all involved in any of this going on? We never talk about that at all.
Well, there's another factor I haven't brought up yet that explains why education in the modern world would lead women to have fewer children. And that is that in the modern world, where everything becomes, all of the institutions of society are ripped apart and turned into mere modules extending the market. Religion becomes an exercise in the marketplace. Politics becomes an exercise in the marketplace. Art, everything that we care about becomes just a way of, selling goods and exchanging money. Under those circumstances, it becomes inevitable that the society looks for ways to exploit having children and make having children more and more and more expensive. When you're living a rural life on a farm, having children is a great blessing. You need a large workforce that cares about whether you survive or not. And one of the ways to do this is have a family. The family cares about whether they survive or not. If they farm well, they're going to eat in the winter. And if they don't farm well, they're not. It's very motivating, right? I mean, and under those circumstances, why not have more kids? You build up this kind of a family structure in which the older kids help take care of the younger kids, which everybody I know of in my family who was older than a certain age, that was how they were raised. Under those circumstances, people are highly motivated to have children. But as people are ripped out of self-sustaining contexts like farms and dropped into cities where you can't sustain yourself, you simply have to labor in exchange for the magic tokens, the money. And under those circumstances, children stop becoming revenue generators, if you will, and they start becoming expensive, and more expensive as the epoch gets more entrenched in its ways of extracting money from everybody who's in it. So it's the reason, I think the reason that education acts as such a birth control is that women, first of all, develop a bunch of skills so that they have alternatives to living at home and having children. But second of all, they become more aware of the financial bind that they're in if they have more children. They don't want to live an impoverished life, so they don't want to have 8 kids in a city where it's a road to poverty. So there's an underlying issue under the education. I'll call on you just a second, Sharon. There's an underlying issue under the education, and this underlying issue translates across different epochs better than the education issue does, and where the education is seen as a derivative effect rather than the original effect. And the original effect is your society structured in such a way that having children is a blessing or a curse? If it structures it so that it becomes a curse, then people are going to catch on, especially if they're educated, and they're going to, in order to survive, they're going to drive down their birth rates. So you'll see issues. We could have a whole 3-hour session talking about late ancient Rome and how many women, as soon as their husband died, they're like, I'm a widow now, and I'm gonna stay a widow for the rest of my life. I'm never having another kid. I'm done. Because if they did that, they would live a higher standard of living than if they had a bunch of kids. And if it weren't for all those widows, Christianity might never have got off the starting gate. It turns out there were, as Paul talks about, and even Jesus talks about, there are a large number of wealthy widows who basically sponsored the early decades of Christianity. So there's very interesting things at work here. I mean, it's a complex subject. Sharon, go ahead. You wanted to add something.
The other point,
wait, Sharon, could I make a quick point that seems to be important just about this? In the Jewish tradition for a long time, where you have women are very well educated in religious Jews too, and the strange paradigm that I don't understand that's different, and it's probably your blessing versus curse, Rick, thing, and the paradigm of what's the carrots and the sticks about, because the women there are generally very well educated, and the women oftentimes take professional jobs so that the men can then go basically do some sort of Bible study with most of their time. And these people are having lots of kids. So it seems to break that rule of women getting educated means women not having kids. And this is in the very religious, extremely religious sects. It's even weirder because the women do all the education in terms of business and professionalism, and the men learn like esoteric mystical texts. And women are oftentimes the bread earners, and the men are not. So it's a weird thing that women are educated and they're having a lot of kids. So I don't really have an answer, and I'm trying to make an objection, but it just seems to be a strange thorn in that educational model that actually is answered by Rick's thing about what does education reflect about whether you're going to be a blessing or a curse and incentivized or whatnot. So
yeah, I think they work together in that way. If your circumstances are such that having lots of children is the road to poverty, then the more women learn about their circumstances and their choices, the less likely they are to want to have a lot of kids. So, there's I think a dialectic between education and the structure of the society. But Sharon, go ahead. You wanted to add something.
Well, the other thing too that I wanted to say is that when women get educated, the whole dynamics of the relationship changes in the marriage, right? Because the whole power structure changes. And the power is no longer the children. The power, it now becomes a partnership instead of a dependency. And the second thing is, if we want to go back to the ancient times and the medieval times, and you take King Solomon, how many concubines did he have? So 900, 700? So therefore, he could have as many children as we wanted. So we came into this, I don't know when we accepted one man, one woman as a marriage. But in the olden times, the man was allowed to have as many concubines or as many wives as he wanted. And there goes your many children. So it's another social change, the way we saw relationships. Once the economics came into it, that changed. The other thing I noticed, Ari, here, and I live in South Florida, in a pretty Jewish community, the Orthodox, the Jews who are Orthodox, I see they have a lot of children, like 8, 9. I see them in the market. But my colleagues who are also Jewish, they have 1, maybe 2, and their husbands are also professional. That's my observation.
Yeah, my comment was more the more religious you are in the Orthodox world, it is like that. But the strange thing in the Orthodox world is then the women oftentimes have the burden of making the money and needing to be very educated. Usually they have a professional job and they're also having the children. And it's usually a weird dynamic that other people are in the community, like family or the husband, spends a lot of time raising the children. So it's actually much what you're describing in this model is different is the Jewish model of marriage, which is actually criticized by Solomon. He's like a bad guy for doing this. Is it's supposed to be a partnership? It's supposed to be two balancing components to a system where each have a supreme power in different domains, and then you negotiate in between your partnership, like where your domains are. So but it's supposed to be a partnership. Like my mom is a scholar of medieval times. It'd be almost interesting to have her in this group. She does talks around the country about medieval Judaism, specifically Rashi's times in France. And it's in that time, the women ran all of the economic aspects, what we call the household of family dynamics, and men were off doing other things. They were just not involved in the economics. So women were, again, in that era, were tremendously educated. And it's a paradigm that you may have heard this sort of stereotype or joke, but in a Jewish relationship, the woman is often very domineering and the man is very submissive. And it's kind of a funny thing that this has some truth to it, that women forever, at least that I've understood in the mythology of Jewish heritage, this is the woman is incredibly the more hierarchical alpha when it comes to the family. She's usually making the ultimate, like the president with the veto power of things, and the husband is more like the Congress doing things. But if she doesn't have approval of it, none of this stuff happens. And that's just my understanding of it. I could be very wrong, but it seems to me from my intro approach of the study, this is a very strange relationship, or just different, that women are very educated in the extremely religious parts and they're making the money, yet they're also having, like you pointed out, like 8 or 9 children. So it sounds like something strange is going on there. That's all I'm really able to say.
It's interesting, right? I mean, I'm going to call on Phil and Stephen in a second, but I'll just add, this is why it gets difficult to generalize. The specific character of the culture and of the people and of their circumstances is what determines what's possible and what works well and what works poorly. But ultimately, it comes back to this Greek question of character, right? And that's where we're going to come back around to Martin Luther King in a few minutes. But first, Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I agree with you, Rick, that mostly it has to do with civilization. I mean, on the farm, you have a lot of children because it's in a way free labor. I mean, it's structured in the family, and not only do they help work the farm when they grow up a little bit, but also because it's in the family, uh, they gave the family support. The parents raise the children essentially help pay for the parents when when they kind of retire, they get old. And so that's support. But civilization have provided a lot of stuff like insurance, you know, break up the family, you know, and all sorts of media and everything else. So you're distracted from being involved with the family. Take a look at it now. You know, everybody's on the cell phone. They're not paying attention to each other. So even if you had that, and then civilization produced this housing in which when you go into the city, it's in cramped quarters. You can't afford to have more than one or two at the most children, unless you live in the suburbs, in which you have a yard and all that kind of stuff. So in some sense, that controls it in some sense because you can't afford to live in a city. Plus something like think of electricity, think of the lights, you know, daylight is extended. You know, you could do work and keep busy. And, you know, you don't have to relate to each other. You have to do so that you extend this. And we even do that socially. That's what the hell is daylight savings time? We have more time to do work, to do something, to produce something for the society. So we got to thank Thomas Edison for the electric light. I mean, that really expanded. We don't have day and night anymore. We have just mostly day, you know, plus all the medium, you know, you can watch football, you can all sorts of things. You could be entertained all day. You never have to speak to your wife or your husband because you're busy doing your thing. So all of that distracts from the relationship that was fundamental. Plus, you know, you can stay up till late. You never have to go to bed and associate with your wife. I mean, that's just for sleeping. In fact, you probably have to end up sleeping on the couch. So all of that is going to avoid that kind of relationship to have children. Plus, you don't have time for children. You know, it's really expensive. You know, now they did help in some sense providing public schools, but you know, public schools are falling apart. So you have to now send your children and a lot of money to private school. Uh, all of that stuff you can't afford to have more than one, maybe at most two. And particularly when you have a civilization that sort of rev up. I mean, for instance, in America, we had this development of industrial society for maybe about, I don't know, 8 generations, you know, so we got adapted into that. You take something like China, started in 1980, you know, until now, suddenly there's sudden change. You know, you move in the city, you live in a condominium, you have at most 2 bedrooms. I mean, how are you going to have 5 or 6 children? I mean, you can't do it. And not only that, China just really messed it up by having a one-child policy, and now this, and of course they value the boys over the girls, so there's an imbalance in the population, you know, and so yeah, and you're right, and when women get educated, you know, they're busy trying to make a living on themselves because now they begin to value themselves rather than depend on somebody else. And so they end up by the time they maybe finally have time, a profession enough to their thing, they're beyond the childbearing age. So in spite of the fact there's fewer women in China than there are men, there are a lot of leftover women that doesn't get married because of that. Yeah, which is interesting, you know, not leftover men, leftover women.
Thank you,
Okay.
Phil.
Leftover women, Phil.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Because some women explain, and she said, you know, when she was young in her 20s, it was things exciting, but she was busy building her profession. And when she got into to her 30s, she never considered marrying men in the 30s or 40s because they were too arrogant to ever pay attention to her. Now she would only consider maybe marrying somebody young or somebody who's 50 who 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 doesn't care about that kind of stuff, or is not egotistical enough. And so that so in that age between when they're 30 to 40, for a woman, you have this dry zone because the men are all too arrogant for you to marry. I mean, the men of that age. But when you get older, maybe you could marry somebody who's 50 years old and he's a little bit more mellow. And so, therefore, you don't have to deal with the arrogance because you're
So,
well educated.
Rick, I'm
Yeah.
going to interrupt Donna, Phil, because I think there are a bunch of other educated women on this call who could absolutely refute what Phil is saying. That's
About
all I have to
China.
say. No,
Yeah.
about in
I'm
general.
only saying that I'm only saying that about China.
Okay. I thought it was in general.
Oh no, no. It's the thing that happens, when we act to try to craft our civilizations by setting policies that say, well, we have this problem and we need to fix it, so we're going to take this action. We usually are more full of hope at our chances of success than we are being cautious about the consequences of our actions. That old song about I knew an old lady who swallowed a fly. I don't know why she swallowed a fly. That one thing leads to another thing. That's what you get with this. The one child policy in China led to this enormous mismatch of huge numbers of male children because the female children had been euthanized or put out for exposure so that they could have a chance at having a male child. And then the result a generation later is a whole bunch of unmarried men because there aren't enough women in China to go around of the right age. And so, this crisis was provoked through the attempt to solve the problem of overpopulation in China without trying to also solve the cultural problem of, misvaluing women in China, the patriarchal attitudes. And the trying to fix the one without the other led to a crisis. There's been much discussed in China and elsewhere, and I think it works as an example of how tricky it is to intervene in an organism, because an organism isn't a machine. It's got all kinds of feedback loops, and it's got semathicity. When you make a change, it's going to make a change, but the change it makes is not just going to be mechanically determined by what you hoped it would be. It's going to be all of the organism's sympathetic systems reacting to what you did, including parts that you didn't take into account. And this is why the Greeks say these things are complex, and you shouldn't think of them like machines. You should think of them like organisms that are aware of you and are making choices not based on what you want the outcome to be, but based on the organism's own intrinsic character, as far as how it's going to respond to things. These are very complex issues. I'm going to go ahead and call on Stephen and Zelig, but with the recognition that what we'd like to do is steer back to the text and to Martin Luther King Day, because we've got good stuff lined up. But go ahead, Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I think you, Rick, you probably started to get to the better determination of things. But there's this huge prejudice that every problem has to have a rational answer. That's in our culture. We need to find the correct idea, dudes. We'll meet around and we'll discuss ideas forever. Now, Schopenhauer pointed out there's this thing, well, he termed it the will. Okay, and he said will and representation, some have translated that way, or will and ideas. But there's this huge prejudice that somehow IQ is the ultimate, and IQ is good for certain things. It's like, for example, I knew a guy, I've known a few people with high IQs, hoping some of it will rub off on me. But there's a strange thing with them. Oh, you're saying no, it didn't rub off on me.
Just shaking my head. Not saying no.
A lot of them can't drive a car. This is the thing. I think there's this claim, you don't know how true it is, but the majority of businessmen who are successful have IQs between 100 and 110, just enough where their IQ is useful without depressing their will excessively. So we keep on saying, oh, there's this guy with an IQ of 75. Oh, they're a nobody. They're nothing. I think be careful with that attitude because there's a lot more going on than mental bookkeeping. This is what intellect is used for. You tend to find in cultures there's a higher IQ along the colder regions where you have seasons where you have to engage, even if you're incredibly primitive, you have to engage in bookkeeping of a sort to survive. You look at along the equatorial belts, the chances of freezing to death are a lot lower. The chances of, living through a season which there is very little food is a lot lower and that you can't move around. You've got to ask yourself if the claims are true that along the equatorial belt that, 75 is the norm. That must be the optimal IQ in circumstances where, everything's pretty available. You don't have to contend with 6 months of winter. So, yeah, I just watch this attitude that somehow the IQ is everything. It's good for reading books. It's good for discussing philosophy. It's good for cataloguing libraries. It's good for bookkeeping. That was Attila the Hun's brother, Attila the Attila the bean counter.
Mm-hmm.
History hasn't remembered him, but there must have been somebody organising everything. I don't know. I just in cancer, you got to be careful. Uh, when did I become? You got to watch out for the ego. When did I become the most important dude in the universe?
Mm-hmm.
We look at ourselves in the mirror, and anything we like, we think is the penultimate. Well, maybe the cosmos has got a different slants on things. But this activity of the will that maybe people with less IQ feel more emotion, are more driven by their will, as Schopenhauer called it. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. I always like to add to discussions of intelligence a couple of things, and one of them is that there are certain categories of blunders that only very smart people can make. If you're not smart enough, there are certain stupid things you can't do, and that's never factored into IQ tests, right? I mean, Germany was the most scientifically advanced, educated, technologically advanced country in the world when they decided to have a Holocaust. That was something that a stupider country couldn't have done. And so, which is the more stupid? The people who have all this intelligence and wield it to harm the world, or the people who don't have it and live in harmony with the world in a sustainable fashion. I also particularly, I remember I think it was an Australian Aborigine IQ test that was designed to show the kinds of things Australian Aborigines were magnificent at, with their ability to find their way through a landscape and recognize the differences between one stone and another so that they wouldn't get lost and die in the trackless wastes of the desert. And then once they had that test developed, they then gave it to a bunch of educated white people who uniformly came out as retarded under this test. It's like there's a reason why, they want to live in their office buildings in their cities with street signs, and they don't want to wander in the outback where they're going to get themselves killed. There are Howard Gardner has this theory. I just saw literally while we were talking that some people are claiming it's pseudoscience, which cracks me up. I'm going to have to do some reading on this to see what the basis of the argument is. I don't think it's pseudoscience. This theory that there are multiple forms of intelligence, it seems to me patently obvious. You know, there are people who have social intelligence of a kind that I can only aspire to and don't have. There are people who have musical intelligence that I can only aspire to and don't have. There are all kinds of different forms of intelligence. You look at a ballet dancer doing astonishing things with their body. They know where they are in space. They know how they can and can't move. And you know, as a low grade aspiring traditional martial artist, I respect the incredible amount of practice and but also mental skill involved in creating the mind-body relationship that makes it possible to do those kinds of movements. I know just enough to be dangerous in the sense that I know just enough to admire what they're doing. I know that it's not just some non-intelligent thing. It's just their body, right? That idea that what's happening there is just their body and therefore doesn't count as intelligence. This is the kind of thing an intellectual says. You know, someone who's a klutz says, well, body stuff doesn't matter. It's like, I may not be as graceful as they are, but I think it matters what they do, and I think it is a form of intelligence. The same is true for emotional intelligence. You know, I grew up with a hyper intellectual father, and you know, it was from him that I learned the object lesson of the white intellectual who says, "I'm not angry." Everybody in the room goes, yes, we can see how not angry you are. You're the only person in the room who doesn't realize that you're angry. You think that you're calm because you're so distanced from your emotions, right? And so you can see that it's possible to be, you know, brilliant mathematically and logically and in computer algorithms while being really backwards on, you know, do you even know what you're feeling right now? You know, do you know what your inner world is like? You know, what's happening in there? Go ahead, Steve.
This was actually, now I remember Goethe was the one that warned about this. He said that IQ is a bit of a cheat, that you generalize.
It's too
And
general.
you actually, you're creating all these thin pages. You're jumping from thing to thing. And as you mentioned, the lacunae, it leaves gaps.
Yes.
And if you think of uh, what was his name again? That's a famous Greek legendary figure. The one that married his mother.
Oedipus.
Oedipus, that's it. Yeah. I have heard a claim that he represented the rational mind. The first time I ever saw anything about Oedipus was a cartoon that was just making a joke of the whole story. And when he defeats the Sphinx, he goes, I'm clever Harry. I must be the smartest dude around. Then he goes and kills his father and marries his mother. So this was the gap that he failed to recognize what was really there.
Yes.
Very smart in a certain way. He answered the Sphinx's question.
Yes.
But then failed to observe what was really happening, failed to get the information.
Right.
The simplest person could see what his problem was, but he had failed to see it. There's something in intellectuals that they're excessively literate. I remember the film Idiocracy, and the point was he thought he could get back to his present time because they told him there was a time machine. And they find, and he goes, what's this? This is an amusement ride. And, you know, the dumb guy says, of course it's an amusement ride. You think there's such thing as real time machines? Boy, for the smartest man in the world, you're pretty dumb, you know. I'm sorry, I've taken up too much of your time, but.
No, it's fine, Stephen. And it really puts its finger on the issue that we're talking about, which is the issue of character. It's like if you could have the highest IQ any human being has ever had, but if you don't know where to point it and you haven't developed the skills and character necessary to support the activity, it doesn't do you any good. You know, you get a whole bunch of high IQ people in a room, and then you say, okay, you know, we're going to operate on this patient and I'd like you to administer the anesthesia. Well, what good is their IQ? Not one of them has an anesthesia skill, right? You shouldn't let them anywhere near the patient. The IQ is not measuring anything useful. It's measuring something abstract. And of course, as Hegel warns us, to abstract is to be an error, right? You have a tendency to overgeneralize. What matters is the specific character of the situation, the specific character of the person, and whether they're a good fit for each other. So, you know, I would rather have Sharon in the room than Einstein when it's time to operate on a patient. Einstein's going to be a menace, right? Sharon is going to help this person live and survive. You know, I don't want to be in the room. I know nothing that's going to be useful to what's happening there. But go ahead, Sharon.
But you know, I think it's Heraclitus who said, "For book learning does not wisdom make."
Right.
And I think that's the issue with IQ. People who have high IQs can certainly get the best out of those books with great numbers, but the integrative process
Right.
can be missing.
Right. Right. Yeah, you get this sort of statistical average of a number of things, and then we call it intelligence. But, you know, the issue for us is that, and I'm gonna drop the MLK quote. This is the one that lots of white liberals like to share. It's from the "I Have a Dream" speech, and they like to share that more than they like to share his letter from the Birmingham jail. I prefer the letter from the Birmingham jail, which I think is quite incisive and trenchant. But this particular sentence from the "I Have a Dream" speech is what brings us back to the text. By the content of they'll be judged by the content of their character, right? MLK is not saying don't judge people. He's saying don't judge people by things that don't matter, like the color of their skin. Judge people by what kind of person they are. You know, how do they treat other people? What is their character? And when he says that, he's saying a very ancient Greek thing. And where this comes full circle back to where we were last week is it comes back to this question of, is the medieval critique of what's wrong with Rome, and by extension, the ancient epoch that the medieval fathers are trying to bring to an end, is that critique strictly a medieval or external critique of the ancient order? Or are they critiquing the ancient order using its own value system? And the argument that I want to make, which Kenneth doesn't make here, but it's implicit in what he's writing, is that part of the reason that the patristic writers, Christian patristic writers, were able to make such headway is that they hoist the ancient world on its own petard. They critiqued it by its own value system and showed that it was failing its own promise. It was failing its own promise. And when I realized 3 weeks ago that I wanted to talk about this, I also realized that when we were doing chapter 4 and we got to the next to last section, we were talking about Sophrosyne, and we walked through Aeschylus and Cornford and looked at the structure of character and arete and ethea and ethos and all those things. We looked at all these things together, and we got a certain distance towards talking about that psychological model of Aeschylus and the ancient Greeks. But we stopped before we got to the punchline that would have explained how and why the medieval critique is actually using the ancient world's own value system against itself. We left out, we stopped short. We left out something important. And so I wanted to take us back there. I also know that several of the people on the call who've joined since then weren't there for that discussion. And I thought it might be useful to go back and summarize where we had gotten, and then move on to the critical point, which is the Achilles heel of ancient Rome, according to the ancient value system. I thought that might be an interesting thing to do. And it follows directly from...
I am definitely interested in that.
Yeah? Okay.
I don't know if we want to do a little vote or whatever, but if I don't want to say, but my voice is simply that I would be interested in that.
Okay. Okay. So, of the people who have their hands up, do you want to add stuff before we go to that?
No.
I don't care. I don't know. I don't know how to
I
answer
can
that
wait.
question
I
other than
can
whatever's
wait.
best for the group. Whatever's
I
best
can
for
wait.
the flow of things.
Okay. What was it you were just saying, Phil?
I can wait.
Okay. Okay. Then and Zelig, what about you? Do you want to add what you have your hand up for now, or do you want to wait?
I'll wait. I'll wait. It's better.
Okay. Okay. So this is my attempt to do in an hour a crash course on what we spent 2 months doing. So we'll see how well this goes. It's based on the following idea. Kenneth Smith highly respects the work of classicist Gilbert Murray. Gilbert Murray wrote a lot in the early 20th century. And among the things that he did is he did verse translations of all of the classical ancient tragedians and also the comedian Aristophanes. And he wrote little forwards to his translations. They're quite interesting. His forward to, I was rereading the opening of the Agamemnon by Gilbert Murray this morning, and it's a short intro and it's very interesting. He really goes to the heart of this question that's in there, which is on the one hand, the Agamemnon's talking about the whole trilogy that Agamemnon is a part of is attempting to depict why vengeance is not a good substitute for justice, why the Greeks need to put behind them the old system of if you wrong me, then my relatives will wrong you, and then your relatives will wrong them, and each attempt to right the previous wrong generates new wrongs. It creates an iron chain of suffering that goes on forever. It's infinite, and that's what Aeschylus is critiquing in the Agamemnon, and that's where the famous quote that Robert Kennedy gave as his eulogy for Martin Luther King. He says he quotes the Agamemnon when he says, drop by drop, it's suffering is what brings us wisdom. You drop by drop. We are unwilling to learn to be wise. We want to cling to our ideologies. We want to cling to our habits and our comforts. And it's only when we suffer as a result of our choices that we begin to question those choices and say, why did I do this? Why? When it becomes clear to us, it's not so helpful when it's just fortune hitting us. Then it's just a random occurrence and we can't learn from it very well. But when it's our own activities and choices that have set us up for failure, we have this opportunity to learn, because now we see for a moment clearly how what we thought was going to bring us the outcome we wanted instead brought us something different. And it makes us ask the question we never asked before. This is why Hegel says the owl of Minerva only takes flight with the fall of night. It's at the late stage of an epoch when things are going wrong, but there's no outside enemy to blame, because you've gone through your flourishing period. You're the kings of the world. You have all the power. You have all the money. And really everything that's happening was your policies and your decisions. And yet somehow things are going wrong. How can that be? And it makes you question the epoch in a way you never did before. And thus philosophy gets reborn in the late stages of each epoch. So Aeschylus, writing at the time of Athens is corruption. As Athens is drifting into corruption, it's becoming clear that there are problems. Aeschylus, like a lot of other writers, is beginning to produce literary works to try to use the old ancient value system to critique what's going wrong in Athens and in the Greek world at large. And as part of that, in Agamemnon, in the other plays in that series, and in all of his other works, he lays out an ancient version of Freudian psychology, if you will. What did the ancients have instead of Freud? Well, they had this. And F.M. Cornford, in his book Thucydides Mythistoricus, he basically looks at Thucydides and looks at Aeschylus and sees what they have in common, and he uses them to document what is the ancient view of human psyche and how it works. And it's all based on character, which is where the Martin Luther King quote comes into play. It's all based on character. So I'm going to share, we don't have English words for most of this. So I'm going to share from an outline that I keep around a number of terms, and we'll go through them really quickly to get to the point that we left off, that we never got to when we did this last year. So let me go pull this up and start dropping them in. It starts with 5 key terms, and I'll put them in the text now. And the 5 key terms are these. We've talked about daimon, right? And this we get this out of Heraclitus. Ethos anthropoi daimon. This is what gets translated as character is fate, the fragment of Heraclitus. But what it actually means is a person's character is their guardian divinity, their daimon. A daimon is like a small god, and it's a small god of some specific thing. And like there might be a daimon of a spring or a waterfall, or of a beautiful stretch of shore. There might be a daimon of a silver mine. Anything that's important to people in nature has its own spirit. And when they say it has a daimon, what they mean is it has its own organismic lawfulness, right? It follows its own rules. And if you want to interact with that part of nature, you have to learn what those rules are. If you ignore those rules at your peril, right? It's like the weather. You want to be a farmer, you better learn about the weather. If you don't pay attention, and the seasons and the cycle of the seasons, if you don't pay attention to when's the right time to plant, you're going to lose your crops, right? So you have to submit yourself to the logic of the daimon that governs that part of nature. You have to find a harmony with it, if you will. You can't fight nature, just like you can't fight gravity. You jump off a cliff and claim you're going to fly, and well, how many generations of adolescent boys have broken their legs jumping off of roofs? Look at me, I'm Superman. Well, unfortunately, you're not. You got to learn. You got to learn to make your peace with the lawfulness of nature, and the Greeks represent that with a daimon, which they treat like a mind, like a psyche, right? That has a willfulness of its own that you have to negotiate with. The second term is nosos. And nosos is any physical or mental disease. Anything that's bad is a nosos. So not just I caught the flu, and that's a nosos, but also, do I have a problem with being too greedy? Am I plagued with greediness? That's also a nosos. They use this generic term for the unhealthy things. Every unhealthy thing is some kind of nosos. And the third term, which unites these two, is a care, K-E-R. The plural is keres. And a care is a daimon that brings a nosos. Every different nosos has its own daimon, just like every rock has a daimon, every waterfall, every spring, every mountain has a daimon. Every nosos has a daimon. Age, death, eros, be too attracted when you shouldn't be. Elpis, to hope for things you shouldn't hope for. Patho, to be persuaded by something you shouldn't be persuaded by. Everything bad is represented as a mind or a spirit, and it plagues you, and that's why you got the flu, or that's why you became greedy, is this care got into you. It brought you this nosos that you didn't want. Or maybe you're so sick that you did want it, and it's only all the people around you who go, God, he's embraced the nosos. If only we could make him stop. The fourth term is entheos. And by the way, it should be clear at this point, we really don't have equivalent terms for any of these things. Our conceptions of disease, our conceptions of the mind, our conceptions of nature, the relationships among these things in the modern world, they have nothing to do with any of this framework that's being built up here. The fourth term is entheos. So if you fall prey to hubris and you decide, you're the king of the world, and you're just going, now that you've hit it rich, you're the king of the world, and you're going to tell everybody what to do. Like you're going to say everybody in China can only have one child. You're going to cure overpopulation by saying every family can only have one child. What's happening there, and it is a hubris because you don't actually understand the problem. The problem has this other dimension of misogyny that's gonna cause a catastrophe. If you tell them all they can only have one kid, most of them are going to pick boys. They're going to kill all their girls, newborns. They're going to expose them and keep it a secret, and then they're going to have boys, and then you're going to have a whole generation that can't reproduce. You're going to have a huge problem, and that's what happened in China. This was hubris. The people who made this policy, it was hubris. They thought they were bigger than they were. They thought they were wiser than they were. They used their power according to what made sense to them, but it was a power that nobody should have been wielding. and the consequences were terrible. And this is not the only example. I'm not trying to pick on China. Yeah, the hubris, plenty of hubris to go around in human history, right? I mean, this was Hitler's problem, right? Hitler looked at the US settling the West by exterminating all the Native Americans and taking their land. And he says, man, if Germany wants to be big, Germany should do the same thing in Europe. But we can't go west. Let's go east. We're going to exterminate all the Slavs. I know we don't teach the Holocaust this way, but this was Hitler's fantasy. If I can just exterminate all the Slavs in Eastern Europe, I'll clear the land just like the Americans cleared the land. And then there will be a greater Germany that just expands to the east further and further and further, all the way to the Pacific, maybe. Won't that be great? I'm just gonna, decide who gets to live and who doesn't in order to create my grand dream. That's hubris. And the way that the Greeks explained this is not that he was crazy, which is the usual, megalomania is the Western explanation. Oh, those are crazy people. He had bigotry. He was full of hate, and that's why he did that. It's like he probably wasn't full of hate. He probably didn't really care about the people. They weren't real people to him. They were just numbers on a spreadsheet or tokens on a board that he was moving around. He was operating in a level at which they're just abstractions. Our explanation is a bad explanation. But the Greeks have a better explanation for it. They say he was possessed. And the word for that state of possession, where a mortal like you or me or Hitler is possessed by a daimon or a god, such as hubris, is entheos. Entheos, the god within, that the god gets into you. And the Greeks believed this applied all over the place. If you read Homer carefully, if you read a good translation of Homer, a literal translation of Homer, you will see that frequently when loose translations say, Odysseus had an idea, the stricter ideas will say things like Athena whispered in his ear, right? They believe that those aha experiences are a moment of possession by a god. Or when Paris is seized with attraction for Helen, who is touched by the gods and therefore a terrible, terrifying creature, shows that Aphrodite isn't such a good goddess. It's a warning about the power that attraction has over the human mind. Paris makes a foolish choice when they're rolling the apples, and he has to pick between the three goddesses, which one gets to be the one who gets the golden apple. And he picks Aphrodite over Athena. What an idiot. He should have picked wisdom so that he would have known who to pick. He picked attraction. And so he became a victim of attraction, and he was attracted to Helen. So he abducts Helen and runs her off to Troy. And the next thing you know, all of Western civilization collapses. The Bronze Age comes to an end because he's possessed, right, by this power that's greater than he is. I think it's in the preview to this book. I can't remember if it's this one, and maybe Donald remembers if it's this one or if it's Webb's. There's a quote, "We are lived by powers we pretend to understand." It's by the poet Auden, I think. And this is a Greek idea that these powers inhabit us and make us do things that we otherwise might not have done. It's a model for example, I use this example a lot for my own family, alcoholism, right? I'm vulnerable to the bottle, so I can't touch the bottle. My wife can have a drink and she's done, that's it. But I don't dare take a drink, because when I look at all my adult family members going back generations on both sides, they all spent either years or their entire life inside the bottle, right? My grandma Pat spent time in the gutters in downtown Seattle, where she'd stumble to after she came out of the bar after partying. She was a party animal who couldn't stop partying. She was possessed by a daimon. This is very easy to explain in the Greek model. Even if it's a metaphor, it's a metaphor that has explanatory power. And so then the fifth and final term in this first group of concepts is methexis. And methexis is the participation of a mortal within the possession. That is, it's not like the movie The Exorcist, where you're just an innocent victim and along comes the devil and he made you do it. It's not that easy. Your own character either protects you from possession by that particular daimon, or your character opens you to possession by that particular daimon. The structure of your character can be explained in terms of which daimons are you on guard against, phylactos, on guard, and which daimons are you vulnerable to, not on guard against, aphylactos. And this pair of terms, here they are. I'll just drop them in the chat so you've got them. This pair of terms comes up in the opening of Aeschylus's Agamemnon, as Cornford points out. Why do, you know, we know in theory that the Agamemnon is going to be this story about Agamemnon coming home and being murdered by Clytemnestra, who has had it with her 10 years absent husband because he sacrificed their daughter in order to make the winds blow the right way so that they could go and murder a bunch of people in Troy. And he had the opportunity not to do it, to back down, but he chose to do it anyway because he was so committed. He wanted to be the mighty king. To be the mighty king, he had to sate the bloodlust of the angry Greeks and to satisfy his brother Menelaus, whose wife was stolen. He had to prove he wasn't impotent because of the oath they'd all sworn. And he went so far that he was willing to violate the laws of heaven and earth by murdering his own daughter just in order to make the winds blow correctly. It's, you know, it's an evil act. So we know that Agamemnon is going to be a play in which he comes home and his wife murders him. And he kind of deserves it. He's an asshole. We saw over and over in the Iliad what an asshole he was. They almost lose the war because he's squabbling with Achilles over who gets to have the pretty slave girl. And, you know, he lets enormous numbers of Greeks die so that he can hang on to the slave girl, even though it means Achilles won't fight for them anymore. And they're losing against the Trojans. He's a dick, right? So Methexis, right? Sorry, we're talking about aphylactos and phylactos. A play like that could open any number of ways, but what you don't expect is the way that Aeschylus actually opens it, which is it's before Agamemnon gets home, but we're not with Agamemnon. So you think, well, then we must be with Clytemnestra, right? Talking about her plotting. No, we're with a random watch guard on the wall at night who's looking out into the darkness. When they see the distant, like in the movie Return of the King, they see one of the watchtower fires light to send the message that the Greeks have won. And this issue of on guard, are you watching? Do you understand what's coming to you? Is throughout this play, phylactos and aphylactos, and he's using it as a metaphor for the human psyche in your own character. Which daimons, which charis that could harm you are you aware of and on guard against? And which ones are you blind to and you just assume, haha, that won't hurt me, I'm fine. I don't need to worry about that thing. I've got it totally under control. How many of my relatives from previous generations have said about their alcoholism, I'm not an alcoholic because I can hold my drink. It's like, you know what not alcoholic people do? They don't constantly test themselves to prove that the bottle doesn't control them because it's not an issue for them. But when you are possessed, you can't see what anybody else can see, which is your own dependency on the situation. So it is the aphylactos state of my maternal grandmother that resulted in her, you know, being a practicing alcoholic who wrecked her liver and, you know, all those other things. Phylactos, aphylactos. So character. We're talking about character. This is at the heart of this issue, going back to Martin Luther King Jr. and judging people by their character. Because the question raised that almost nobody asks about the I have a dream speech. The question isn't, oh, good, we can all just sit down and sing Kumbaya together. Racism is in the past. Let's just not do anything about it. That's what a lot of people take away as the message of I have a dream. It's clearly not what he's saying. He's talking about the need to judge people by the content of their character instead of by the color of their skin. And he's raising the question implicitly, which is, how do you go about evaluating the content of a person's character? Right? Racism's easy. But if you're going to rise to the challenge of putting aside racism and saying, what if we look at people, as who they actually are, you have to ask the question, well, then how are you supposed to look at character? And what Cornford is saying is that Thucydides and Aeschylus are giving us a recipe, the ancient recipe for how to do it. So this is 5. So we've done 5 terms there. We've done 2 terms on phylactos and aphylactos. There's going to be more. We're going to set up this whole thing. So let's do the next part. The next part, and Joe's not here, but you know, this is totally thinking about Joe, is agency versus contingency, a major question that the Greeks wrestle with. Right? And according to Cornford, Thucydides splits these terms. He says gnome Gnome is the way that Thucydides uses the term for agency. When we make plans and we try to make a plan, we try to bring it to fruition, we act in the world through our will. This is Gnome. This is our agency. But Tyche, which you might say Tyche, I think is how people often say it in English. But Tyche is fortune. And it is necessity, ananke, in the form of a surprise, when the laws of nature and the laws of history unfold in such a way that something happens that you didn't predict, that you didn't expect. That's Tyche. So Thucydides gives examples over and over in his history of the Peloponnesian War of the Athenians winning an early battle through Tyche, luck, instead of Gnome, their plans. But
can I ask you a question? Is
yes.
Gnome related to what we're saying gnosis, or
Sure
just
is.
different firms? Okay, they are. Are they the same like root in the word kind of thing?
It's the same word root.
Yeah.
It's
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. That's all. I don't need more. I was just curious if they're like the same word or they just happen to sound similar.
No, if they sound similar, in these highly inflected languages like Latin and Greek, if they sound very similar, like the Gnome and Gnosis, there's a very high likelihood that they are exactly the same word with a different declination. The words are conjugated and declined and so forth into new meanings. And ancient Greek does that so much. So there is some, and I'm not far enough along in my studies to be able to tell you what the exact derivation of gnome is. How does it come to have this meaning of agency when gnosis is such a different concept? But once I learn the grammar, I'm sure I'll be able to trace it, and there will be some connection that right now is not obvious to me. So Tyche is when necessity, ananke, the laws of nature, unfold in a way that we don't expect. So the Athenians win these early battles by luck because the Spartans happen to be busy somewhere else. But they fail to recognize the role that luck has played. One of the themes of the history of the Peloponnesian War, which is sometimes implicit and sometimes explicit, is a wise person recognizes when they have succeeded through luck. And when they have, they then proceed very cautiously and they try to consolidate their gain by making as much peace as they can, getting people to accept the new condition. Whereas what you do when you're affected with hubris is you mistake the Tyche for gnome, and you say, it is my prowess. I'm just that great. That's why I won. You see this all the time with people who get rich, who have a business and they get rich. And they fail to recognize that it was both Tyche and gnome that let them get rich. And once they're rich, they say, well, then there was no Tyche. It was just me. I was just that good. And then they proceed to make a debacle of their company because they're not cautious now. They overreach. They think, if that happened, I should be able to do it again whenever I want. And now I want to do this other thing. And this is how, according to Thucydides, this is how the Athenians lose the Peloponnesian War, is having secured about half of a victory against Sparta at home. They then decide that it was all due to gnome and none of it was due to Tyche. And they decide to start a second arm of the war. They decide to launch the world's greatest fleet off to try to conquer Syracuse in Sicily at exactly the time when they shouldn't be doing that. And the Spartans warned them, now would be a great time to make some peace, consolidate your gains. We can all make, you can have a going concern. You just have to recognize the ancient wisdom that the Greeks have always had, which is when you win by luck, you have to be cautious. And the response from the Athenians is, of course you say that, you're the loser. We're just that good. If we were so good as to do this, then we can totally beat you at the same time that we're fighting Sicily. And as Thucydides says in the Peloponnesian War, after the launch of the beautiful ships with all their gold and glory and silks and so on, they're never seen again. Only one ship comes home. The entire fleet, the great armada, is lost because of hubris. Gnome and Tyche. There's a dialectic between gnome and Tyche, and a wise person recognizes that they're both always at work. But we are tempted by character frequently to misunderstand how it is that we arrived where we did. And when we make that misunderstanding, we then launch our future plans based on an overestimation of our own powers. And with that overestimation comes catastrophe. That's the argument of Thucydides. So the next bit Not everyone is prone to make that misestimation. Some do, some don't. What is it that determines it? And this is where, Heraclitus's ethos anthropoidaimon gets complex. It says, well, the thing about your character, there's several different elements going on at the same time. It's a multidimensional problem. One of the elements is, what were you born with? There's a certain amount of 2K involved in what kind of character you're born with. It's not your choice. It's not your parents' choice, right? It's influenced by your genetic heritage, which is a lottery, right? It's influenced by the cultural upbringing of your parents, of your relatives, of your neighbors, of your culture. All of those things have an effect on you before you ever become conscious enough to begin making decisions in your life. So by the time you can start asking questions like, what kind of person am I and what should I do next? You've already got a character that you didn't pick, that, as Kenneth would say, you inherited from your obscure prior self, who is less clear to you than you are now. So dysdaimon was the condition in which you were unlucky because you were born with a poor character, right? And we'll talk about cultivating your character later. And the equivalent is like being haunted by an evil spirit. Instead of a guardian angel, you've got a guardian devil. And your guardian devil is constantly tempting you to do the wrong thing, and you make a mess of your life because of your dysdaimon. The alcoholism, genetic alcoholism of the kind that runs in my family, is a kind of dysdaimon, right? I mean, it's luck of the draw. And if you know it's there, then you could be phylactos. But if you deny it's there, or you never learned that it was a possibility to have it, then you have aphylactos, and you're likely to be vulnerable to the bottle. It's an interesting relationship here, right? Between, do you know yourself, gnothi seauton, and what kind of character were you born with? These things were all originally part of a coherent system of describing the human psyche. And of course, eudaimon, good daimon, is if you were born lucky. You're lucky enough to have a character that automatically, resists some of the more common terrors. The kinds of daimons that might possess you and make you want to do the wrong things. Your character, your daimon, is lucky enough through circumstances to inoculate you against those things. You may have problems in your life, of course, as the Buddha says, everybody does, but they're not going to be those common, obvious problems because you were lucky enough to be born with a character that protects you from it. So where this gets interesting is that Heraclitus and the other classical Greeks are basically arguing it's not just fate. Character as fate is actually a bad translation of ethos anthropoidaimon, because that suggests fatalism. That suggests that you don't, it's all luck of the draw. You might as well do the astrology, find out if you got the good daimon or bad daimon. If you got the good daimon, celebrate for the rest of your life. And if you got the bad daimon, you wail and gnash your teeth, and your life's going to be a mess, and it's not your fault. The Greeks said that's way too simple. That's not how it works. Because remember from chapter 4, the core metaphor that the Greeks use for all things is not a machine or an object, but an organism. And what defines being an organism is symathesy, that you learn. You're in a perpetual learning relationship with your environment. You are alive to what's happening around you. And when things change around you, then you change inside and do something different to try to harmonize with the new circumstances. That's what it means to be an organism. That's what separates an amoeba from a rock. When it rains, the amoeba might decide to go somewhere else, but the rock can't. Its character is too simple. It's just going to sit there and be a rock and erode over the next centuries and thousands of years. So our character is not an object that's fixed. It is a growing thing. It can grow and learn. And one of the ways that it grows and learns is through habits and behavior. The things that you do a lot get strengthened. The things that you do rarely, they weaken. We all know this from our skills, right? My high school Spanish atrophied for decades until I started studying it again, because I wasn't using it. There was a time when I was very fluent. When I was an adolescent, I was so fluent, I could talk to someone from Brazil, even though I didn't speak a word of Portuguese, because Portuguese is just the other side of being a dialect of Spanish. It's close enough that if you really, really pay attention, you can just catch what they're saying. if you're really good at Spanish. So I had those skills, but 20 years later, I didn't have them anymore. They atrophied. So I didn't exercise them. And that's how it is with your character. So, you might be born phylactos, on guard against a bunch of terrible things, but if you don't work and exercise those parts of your character, they will atrophy and your character will change until the eudaimon you were born with senesces into a dysdaimon. You know what I mean? You can wreck your own character through failure to work and develop those faculties. And the converse is true. You could be born with a terrible character, but if for whatever reason you can be convinced to start cultivating your character, you can develop better habits. I can be born an alcoholic, but develop the habit of avoiding the bottle so that this particular aspect of my character stops being a liability and becomes a mere detail, right, in my life. I mean, I've never lived my life in the bottle. It took literally the bad example of every other adult member of my family for generations to give me that level of wisdom about this flaw in myself. It had to come from outside because my own character was vulnerable, but it did come from outside. So I learned the phylactos, and so I fixed that part of my character. Plenty of other parts of my character, like my Spanish, went by the roadside, but that part got better. So you can be born with a dysdaimon, but if you put in the work, you can cultivate it into a better daimon. You can change your character. And if we accept the poor definition, the poor translation of ethos, anthropoi, daimon, if we accept character as fate as the summation, then the corollary that is implicit in those same three words is you can change your fate by changing your character. Donald often quotes Kenneth as saying, if you want to become an Aristos, you've got to find an Aristos and follow them around and learn from their example. How do they think about things? How do they act in the world? This is the basis for all traditional Okinawan martial arts. You want to be a great traditional Okinawan martial artist? Find a sensei. Right? You're not going to get it from videos. Find a sensei and follow them around and see what they do. Have them do the kata and you do the kata with them, and preferably with a dialogue, and you will gradually pick up things from outside that are good for your character that your own character could not have generated on its own. But if you work your character with those examples, you can improve your character, and then maybe someday when you're old, you're the sensei and you're teaching a new generation of kids, because you have cultivated your character to the point that it's able to do that. Sharon in anesthesia, she spent so long learning to be the great anesthesiologist that she became. This is not something she was born with. From the perspective of the character required to be a great anesthesiologist, she was born with a dysdaimonia. Nobody's born with the character required to be a great anesthesiologist. It's not something that you're just born with. You have to cultivate it, and it's hard. And it's a lot of work. It takes a long time. But she put in the time and she cultivated that character to the point that, now I would trust her over Einstein in a heartbeat. Seems to be the person deciding anesthesia in a surgery room, right? And any of us would. You can modify your character if you work at it. One of the things that we're going to see when we get to the end of this discussion today is that part of what went wrong in Imperial Rome is that the circumstances were such that people didn't have enough good examples around them. Their culture was offering them bad examples instead. And it became actually dangerous to try to behave like an Aristos in Imperial Rome. You're going to get yourself killed. There was a lot of people being killed off. You couldn't stick your neck out too far, even for the current emperor, even in his support, because sooner or later he's going to die. And the next emperor might hate everything that he did and might start by purging all his supporters. So rising up, you became the nail that stuck up and got hammered down. There became, for survival reasons, there became a kind of conventionalism, and mediocrity became the road to survival. You didn't dare try to pursue excellence in ways that were likely to change from one administration to the next, or you're screwed. And those are the kind of circumstances in which it's hard for people to cultivate their character in a healthy direction when everything around them is militating against it. We'll come back to this issue, but I mean, all of this is related to the medieval critique of the ancients. But let's go on to the next set of terms. And this is where we were really focused last time. I'm going to paste first half of them, first half and then the second half. Here's a bunch of terms, and here's a bunch of terms. We're making progress. At this point, we've now put over half of the terms in. So we'll work our way through these quickly. And there's a couple more that I added since the last time we did this, but I've got most of it. And this has to do with how do you live a healthy life? How do you live a good, fulfilling, wholesome life is the question that the Greeks are trying to get at here with character. So we start with the term ethos itself. That's the term that Heraclitus uses in ethos anthropoi daimon, ethos. And ethos means character, your disposition, your inner nature, your inner lawfulness. The words logos and phusis and ethos are all very closely related. The Greeks used the term nature in exactly the same ambiguous way that we do. When we say nature, on the one hand, is everything, the laws of nature. But on the other hand, it's also not everything. It's like Donald's behavior is driven by Donald's nature, his own nature. And the Greeks would use that exact phrase, translated into Greek, as a synonymous to saying it's his character. His character is his nature. And if you think of the Greeks as being a pantheistic religion, the ancient epoch is an epoch in which nature is above the gods, which is above men. Even the gods are mere expressions of aspects of nature. Daimones are aspects of nature. Nature itself is supreme, and people are subordinate to it and subject to it and have to learn how to live a life harmonizing with it. Under that context, you can see why it's important to them to talk about if you're going to be subject to some part of nature, you need to learn the character of that part of nature. That is to say, you have to learn the details of its lawfulness. Why does it behave how does it behave, and why does it behave the way that it does? And this is why there's a theme in Heraclitus, although a lot of people don't recognize it. He does everything except come out and say it. He talks around it over and over, in which he says, human beings don't just live in one nature. We're amphibians who who are subject to two natures. We're subject to the nature around us and its laws and its character, but we're also subject to the nature within us and its laws and its character. And he spends a lot of time talking about that point. Like when he says, you couldn't discover the limits of the soul, even if you journeyed through all its pathways for the rest of your life, such as its profundity. He says we're finite beings poised between two infinities, the infinite nature around us, which obviously circumscribes, it bounds and limits our choices, but also the infinity inside of us, the other organism, the organism of our character that is growing and learning and has been doing that since before we could even ask questions about it. We're always playing catch up with our own character to try to figure out who the hell are we, which is why the first precept of the Greek religion is gnothi seauton, know thyself. They're trying to say you don't. You think you do, but you are deeper than you think you are. You have unplumbed depths. And those depths that you don't know about, they're still binding upon you. If you don't learn what they are and how they work, then some of the 2K, some of the surprises that are going to come your way, some good, some bad, are going to come from inside you. You didn't know when you took a drink that you were going to not be able to put the bottle down. Why would you suspect that if you didn't have information about your character, to warn you, to put you on guard? You just blunder into it, and the next thing you know, you're caught in a chain of causality that you didn't see coming. Every bit as much as if you accidentally stumble in the wrong place and you get hit by a car and now you have to walk with a cane for the rest of your life. I mean, these chains of causality that bind us don't just bind us from the complex, difficult to understand world around us. They bind us from the complex, difficult to understand world within us. Ethos anthropoi daimon. So far, this makes a cycle, right? All the things we've talked about, they all relate to a kind of psychology of the human animal. But the rest of the terms take us up another level. And this is what we were doing when we were finishing up chapter 4. I don't know, 4 months ago, 5 months ago now. And that is, how does the individual live in the world? Not just do you know yourself, that's very individual focused, but how are you supposed to live in the world? How are cultures formed? How do societies work? And all of that is part of the same overarching schema of daimones and ethos and all of this. Because the ambiguity in Greek, ethos, anthropoi, daimon, doesn't just mean a man's character is his guardian divinity. It also means humanity's character is humanity's guardian divinity. And also a family, a human family's character is that family's divinity. And a culture, at every level of organization, every level of scale that you can think of for Homo sapiens, the Greeks would say that too is an organism. And it follows the rules of organisms, such as having its own character. A family has a character, a neighborhood has a character, a polis has a character, a tribe has a character, a clan has a character. All of Homo sapiens has a character, and all life on Earth has a character. Each ecosystem, I mean, it goes on, right? And the point isn't to belabor it and say, haha, this is complicated, you should give up. It's to say, this is the challenge of life. And if we want to rise to the challenge, this is what we have to rise to. We have to learn a lot about a lot of things, including all of these different characters, kind of concentric characters that include us at different levels. So this is where the next batch of terms comes from. The Greeks gave up drinking. They like their alcohol. But they recognized that Dionysus was powerful, right? Powerful. I think it's fascinating that, Bacchus is just the Roman god Bacchus, who the Romans said was the equivalent of Dionysus, even though he really wasn't, is really just the god of drunks. But Dionysus is the god of character. Dionysus is often pitted against Apollo versus Dionysus. Nietzsche talks about this, Apollinian versus Dionysian. And he's talking about how the Apollinian side of things is the logical, coherent, intellectual, educated, enlightened side of things, rational side of things. But Nietzsche says, but to the Greeks, the Dionysian side of things, the darkness, the irrational, was nevertheless equally important. We couldn't live without it. Your feelings, your instincts, your memories, and of course what he says is your character, your ethos, this thing that is determining the outcome of your interactions with the world, that is not the realm of Apollo. That's the realm of Dionysus. And that's why Dionysus is the sponsor of Greek theater, including the tragedies that are designed to reveal character under stress, like when Aeschylus is writing the Agamemnon. We put Agamemnon and Clytemnestra under stress so that they will stop lying to themselves and others and will reveal their actual inner character for us to see, to watch, to find out who they really are. One of the points in the introduction to Gilbert Murray's translation of Aeschylus that he makes is that until her final lines in the play, Clytemnestra doesn't say one true thing. She absolutely covers up her character because she is furious with her husband and she needs to lull him into a sense of security so that he will lower his guard so that she can murder him, which she needs to do because he has committed an unforgivable crime. He has to go. But she's not going to be, he's a mighty warrior with, all the Greeks at his disposal. She's never going to get a chance unless she can convince him that she's the loving wife, that she isn't. So her character is hidden all the way through the play until after she murders her husband. The play exposes the real Clytemnestra, her ethos. Of the people who have hands up, do people have things that they wanted to say about what we said so far? Sharon put her hand up just now, so I suspect it was a question about this particular thing, and I want to address that before I go on. So go ahead, Sharon.
Well, what I was about to say is all these terms are very, very good, but I'm struggling to put it into some kind of practical concept.
I'm working on it.
Yes, and I think I finally came up with it. Your character allows you to lead a life. And that life can be a good life. You want it to be a good life based on all the terms that you have described, you have identified here.
Right.
So I came up with two big groups. A good life could be either an enviable life or an admirable life. An enviable life is an external life. It's money, it's accomplishment, it's positions. Well, an admirable life is one of that's around virtue. And that's how far I've gotten. And it's not, they're not discrete. Each life has mixtures of those two. So that Abraham Lincoln led an admirable life, but he didn't lead an enviable life. He was depressed. He got killed. He lost his kids.
Yes.
Enviable about that,
That's
right?
right.
Mother Teresa, she led an admirable life in that she gave of her very self to the poor in the streets of India. I think it was Calcutta. And that's an admirable life. That's the ultimate life of virtue, right? But that would not be my life.
Right.
So as I listen to you describe all these terms, all these components go in to make one of those buckets, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the real, the practical application is coming up next. It's the very next thing. So we're going to, next set of terms, take it outside of knowing yourself and into what is to be done.
Okay, good.
And so this is, again, where the Greeks have a really unusual take. According to Cornford, and I think his take on Thucydides and Aeschylus is right on after rereading Thucydides and rereading Aeschylus. I don't think he's bending. I don't think his thumbs on the scale. I think he's accurately reporting something that is very easy for moderns to miss. And so that's what the next set of terms is about. So it goes like this.
Wait, Phil, Rick, I wanted to say I'm happy to speak whenever's available after maybe even Zelig or Phil. I mostly want to marry some concepts we were talking about before, really this thing idea of IQ versus EQ kind of thing, or even what Sharon was talking about, admirable versus envy. But it's really in what you're talking about now. So I'm happy to, or even if I don't get a chance to speak, it's more like a commentary, my own commentary on what everybody's saying, what you're saying now. So it doesn't, I'm happy to wait till after everyone else gets a chance. And I would like to hear your presentation. So I think that I'm trying to answer your question about when or how I wanted to speak. So
I appreciate it, Ari. Okay, then I'll go ahead and proceed and finish off this section, and then we can go entirely to discussion and Q&A. After we've got to ethos, the next part of the discussion has to do with, so what are we supposed to do with this complicated psyche, and how are we supposed to live in the world? And Aristotle and others give us enough to work with to see what they took for granted as the human condition. And what they saw, moderns often summarize as misanthropy, that they saw the human condition as a real problem. Yes, Agamemnon does also bring home another woman to flaunt in front of his wife, a woman that he enslaved. She wasn't there voluntarily. Yeah, Cassandra, who predicted disaster for everybody. This isn't going to end well for everyone. And she was doomed by Apollo that no one would believe her true prophecies. So they don't listen. And she is just this horrible, tragic figure all the way through this. So what is the problem of the human animal? And what Aristotle and others say is the problem of the human animal is that each animal in nature is ingeniously fitted by nature into the larger structure of the ecosystem. They have ways of life that harmonize with the larger nature. And they harmonize in a couple of ways. One way that they harmonize is as that animal pursues that way of life, in general, they're able to succeed enough in order to live a good life by their terms and reproduce and have young that can go on to do it in their turn. And that's striking because people often can't figure that stuff out. There are countless conspicuous examples we all know, both from public and from personal lives of people that we've met or related to, of people who can't get their shit together. And you don't see a failure rate that high among the animals. You do in things like the acorns dropped. This is a point Stephen likes to make, and I'm going to reiterate it. You do see this sort of failure rate, and a much higher one, in things like the number of acorns that get dropped by an oak tree, of which hardly any turn into a new oak, right? It's a rare occurrence to get a new oak out of an acorn. And there are certainly, insects, and there are some other kinds of invertebrates, such as mollusks, that have vast numbers of children, and they just throw them out into the world and say, "Good luck, kids. most of you will die." In fact, there's a famous Far Side cartoon in which I think it's a mother praying mantis talking to her little praying mantises, and the only caption is her saying, "Of course, most of you will be eaten before you ever grow up." And it's like there is that happens, but in general, especially among the mammals, the failure rate's a lot lower than it is among human beings. A lot of us just cannot figure things out. And the Greeks noted that and said, the human animal has some kind of very particular problem here. And it's something that needs to be explained and understood to see if we can do anything about it. But that's not the only thing about most animals, that they fit ingeniously into their ecosystem such that they can survive. The other part that's astonishing is that they fit into the larger ecosystem in such a way that the ecosystem survives and, in fact, thrives. It's like the studies of how if you let wolves hunt caribou, they don't hunt the caribou to extinction, and instead the caribou herds get stronger generation by generation. And even as late as the 1970s and 80s, it was US government policy to exterminate wolves, and that would make the caribou better. And it took a lot of fighting and scientific discovery, but a lot of fighting to get the government to admit that actually it seems that if you let the wolves prey on the caribou, they take the weak, the sick, preferentially, right? That the 9 times out of 10, if there is a caribou with cancer in the herd, that's the one the wolves are going to catch. It's sicker, it's weaker, it can't keep up, it dies. If it had a genetic predisposition to cancer, it doesn't pass that along to the next generation. So the herd gets stronger. It's a strange thing. You probably all saw the other study that, how reintroducing wolves to Yellowstone, changed the course of rivers. There's all these complex network effects that happen with most animals in their relationship to the larger ecosystem. That is, they're not just taking. Somehow the way that they live and take also gives at the same time. There's a healing that happens through the normal course of life. Even if it's a violent life, the cheetah takes down the gazelle over and over and over. The cheetah takes down the gazelle, but somehow there's still lots of gazelles. This ecosystem doesn't suffer. And the Greeks noticed that too. And they said, how the hell is that happening? There's some kind of hidden harmony at work, right? And that's a Heraclitus line, right? The hidden harmony is better than the obvious. He says nature works through some kind of hidden harmony in which these organisms harmonize with the larger ecosystem, not only to their benefit, but to the ecosystem's benefit. And the Greeks say that's what defines an organism. An organism is always part of a larger organism. And if it is a true organism, then not only does it benefit from the relationship with the larger organism, but also the larger organism also benefits from it participating in it. If that's not true, then it's not a healthy organism. And the Greeks couldn't help but notice, how often do people wreck their own ecosystems? How often do we overgraze and turn land into barren, parched desert? And the Greeks saw it happening. They talked about it. And how often do we, overpump an aquifer, and wreck it? How often do we, take too much and not replace it, and then find ourselves not having any afterwards? The Greeks said this is something people do frequently. And again, like the other question, this has to be answered. Why? Why is this animal different from other animals? Nietzsche talks about this when he calls us the sick animal. He says there's something about Homo sapiens that isn't quite right. It's as though most other species are fully evolved to their habitats, but somehow we're only half-baked. It's like maybe it's our distant descendants who will have that kind of harmonious relationship, but for whatever reason, we don't. So the Greeks set out to explain that with this next set of terms. The first term is ethea, which grammatically is just the plural of ethos, ethea. And the ethea came to mean the proper range of behavior and way of life for your ethos, right? That is to say, the cheetah is able to live the cheetah way of life, the cheetah ethia, because each individual cheetah develops the cheetah ethos, the character of a cheetah. And that character and its way of life are directly related to each other. It isn't the case that any animal is infinitely adaptable, say the Greeks. It is the case that each animal has a character that makes it behave in ways that fit well into its proper way of life, its ethia. And that's what allows it to harmonize to the benefit of the ecosystem and the individual. They do that. You can see it in action. You can see the more you study botany and zoology, the more you discover these astonishing adaptations, both physically and in terms of behavior, that fit these creatures beautifully into their larger matrix. That set of behaviors that a cheetah, will take a bath when it gets dirty, or after it's eaten, it's got blood on its muzzle. It'll take a bath and get clean again. Why? So that it doesn't stink, so the prey can't smell it coming. If it didn't take the bath, it would be a bad hunter. It's got to be able to sneak up, and it can't do that if it reeks. So cheetahs are desperate about keeping clean. They're constantly bathing. That behavior is directly related to the rest of the way of life. And the same is true for all the rest of the cheetah behaviors. There's a whole constellation of interlocked behaviors. That's the ethia. And then two terms that I didn't have last time. One of them is bios. Now we know bios from biology, like it means life. And likewise, zoe, also means life, and we use it in zoology to refer to animals. But the original Greek terms are more nuanced and interesting than that. The bios is your livelihood. How do you make a living? Right? Well, the cheetah makes its living from gazelles and other small animals. Those animals are the basis of its ethia. Its behaviors are adapted to make use of that resource, or that set of resources, the gazelles and the dik-diks and the other small animals that it preys upon. Your bios is your livelihood. And then your zoe is what is the specific part of the world around you that you're attached to. So that would be the gazelle. And the bios is the way of life around the gazelle. And the ethia is the set of behaviors that the cheetah develops that allows it to live that way of life around the gazelle. So it can survive because of the gazelle. The gazelle is its link to life, but only because, first of all, the cheetah has made the gazelle central. That's the zoe. And second of all, it has set up a whole range of behaviors to allow it to relate to the gazelle in this way. That's its ethia. And the result of that is that it can live the bios, the way of life of a gazelle hunter. These terms are very closely related, but it's like connect the dots. Each of these things sets up the next one. There's a whole, and it all traces back to ethos. And the link for ethos, I'll come back to Geras in a moment. The link to ethos is arete. Your character sets you up to have an easy time developing in some directions and a hard time developing in other directions. If your character makes you want to practice stalking and taking baths and running fast, then you just might be able to become excellent at those things. You might develop the arete of being the fastest land animal. And if you can do that, then you can live the bios of a gazelle hunter. Right? You have to have the character that corresponds to the range of behaviors, the ethia, that makes it possible to live the bios so that you can exploit the part of life, the zoe, that's keeping you alive. All these things have to work together. It is causally related to each other.
Can you repeat that a little bit? Do it briefly, but almost try to repeat exactly what you just said, like the last 100 words almost, where you had that nice chain. I missed a few in the middle, specifically with like ethos. And so I'd like to hear it again.
Your ethos, your character makes you want certain things and not want other things. And if you're going to live the life of a gazelle hunter, it needs to make you want to cultivate the kinds of excellence, the arete, that a gazelle hunter has to have, like being able to stalk very well through the grass, being able to take baths so that you're clean so that nobody can smell you coming, and then being able to be the fastest land animal so you have a chance of catching the gazelle. You have to have those aretes to live the life, the bios of being a gazelle hunter. And those arete will allow you to pursue the specific behaviors, the ethia, that make up that bios. If you do all those behaviors, if you have the excellence, then you can do the behaviors that allow you to live the livelihood so that you can exploit the zoe, the part of nature that's keeping you alive, the gazelle. It all has to work together. The ethos makes possible the development of the arete, which allows you to engage in the ethea, the behaviors, which lets you live the bios, the livelihood, the way of life. All of which depends on the gazelle, the zoe. And for every different species, there is a different set. There's different parts of nature that they're dependent. There are bacteria that live in the mud and are never exposed to oxygen, and they don't get their energy from doing a traditional metabolism like we're used to with oxygen. They do metabolisms off of sulfur. They live in mud near sulfur deposits, and they spend their whole life buried in the mud, using sulfur the way we use oxygen. And they don't need anything else, right? I mean, we need oxygen, they need the sulfur. So their character and their behaviors make possible, right, the way of life that depends. Their zoe is the sulfur. They have a sulfur metabolism. And if they had the ethos of a cheetah, they couldn't do that. A cheetah would die under those circumstances. It's not just that they're single-celled, it's that their character, both physically and behaviorally, is designed to link them from the zoe to a sustainable way of life that puts them in harmony with the larger world through these steps. So that's the chain. That's the pieces. And the thing that's important about this to the Greeks is they recognize that all the other animals have it. And what it means that all the other animals have it is that the animals are linked to those things. It's not just that the cheetah can't stop thinking about the gazelle. It's that you can't get the cheetah to think about the things that people care about. You can't get it to care about making money. You can't get it to want to be a social climber, in upper New York among the hoity-toity people. You can't do that. You can't turn it into an art critic. And it's not because it's stupid. Because like we were talking about the Aborigine IQ test, it is brilliant at the things that it does. We are incompetent at the things that it's brilliant at. It is, here's something I didn't mention before when we did this 4 months ago that I could mention briefly. People used to think that dogs were smarter than cats. Now we know they're roughly equally smart, but in very different ways. And the reason that people thought that cats were stupid is that they were using dog tests on cats and the cats weren't interested. They said, well, obviously this cat can't be taught to behave, can't be taught to do tricks. It's just dumb. But then there were all these stories that kept coming in about sometime when an owner would die or be away from home for too long, and they'd come home and they'd find that the faucet in the sink was on. Right? The cat had run out of water, so the cat turned on the sink. They're like, wait a minute, how does a dumb animal turn on the sink? Is it random? If it's random, why does it keep happening? And they have all these stories like this. And what they discovered about cats is cats are very motivated by food and water and a few other things. And if you choose the moment before you feed them, you could teach them all the same tricks you can teach dogs, and they'll get it just as quick as the dogs will get it. But if you try to teach them when they have a full belly, they don't care. They're not pack animals. They're not motivated by pleasing you. They don't want to make you happy. That's not what's driving them. The dog is desperate for your attention. Please love me. Please, please, please love me. I'll do anything to get you to love me because it's a pack animal. The cat might want you to love it, but it's not going to be hyper motivated over love. It's going to be hyper motivated to learn to do tricks when it's thirsty. And when it's thirsty, it will learn all kinds of things very quickly, even things that dogs can't learn. So this issue of character, when is something smart and when is it stupid? The IQ tests don't, a linear integer doesn't have the ability to measure what this Greek model measures for us beautifully, which is that you have to have a certain kind of character to develop certain kinds of excellence, to be able to engage in certain kinds of behaviors, to live a certain kind of life that allows you to harmonize with some part of reality that can keep you alive. That whole chain has to work, and that chain is different for every animal, and there's no one test that can test all these chains at the same time. If there are, I don't know how many different species of animal exist in the world today. I'd have to look it up. It is a very big number. There are at least that many different ways of life, and therefore characters that correspond to them. Cats, even different cats are different from each other. The cheetah is different from the leopard, which is different from the lion. Which is different from the jaguar. They have different ways of life. They have different characters. They have different intelligences. And they're fit beautifully. Now, the problem for Homo sapiens is that we're missing what these other animals have. And there's a reason why we're missing it. You can't get the cheetah to be interested in pushing the red button to launch all the nukes to defeat all the other cheetahs and become the one surviving cheetah. But you can get a person to do that. In fact, there's lots of people who want to get their hands on the button, whether they want to nuke the Russians or whether they want to nuke the heathens or whoever the hell they want to nuke. There's plenty of people who think, you know, I want the power. I need the power. The cheetah doesn't want the power. And that's central to its character. Not just what it wants and what it notices and what it cares about, but what it doesn't want and doesn't notice and doesn't care about. If it could be convinced to care about those things, it could not live the cheetah way of life. It is both the presence of the interest in the things that are healthy for the cheetah and also the repelling of any interest in the things that make the cheetah sick. You can put big piles of money on the Serengeti and you can't get the cheetah to, you know, roll around in it like Scrooge McDuck rolling around in his piles of gold. The cheetah can't be convinced to do that. It doesn't care. It doesn't want to. And if it did care, it would make it sick. It wouldn't be able to live the cheetah life. It would be diverted from the things it should be caring about, which are a full-time occupation to live the cheetah life. So the Greeks represent these two parts. Can you focus on the things you need for your way of life? And can you repel the things that would be bad for you to live that way of life? Can you do both of those things? The positive and the negative. And they have terms for these. So phronesis is the mental faculty of thinking in the direction of what's healthy and good for you to live your way of life. And Aristotle talks about this, although the translations don't do it justice. And he says the cheetah has phronesis. It notices and it cares about and it yearns for, is obsessed with the things that are good for it. I don't think he uses the cheetah as an example. He uses plenty of others. But I like the cheetah because it's such a specialty animal. It's a great example. It wants to take the baths. It needs to take the baths. It's going to take the baths. It's going to learn how to stalk through the grass. It's very interested in being sneaky. And it loves to run fast. It's going to run fast. You can hardly keep it from running fast. Right? All of those things are present. It orients, like the way a sunflower follows the sun, the cheetah orients to these behaviors. And the Greeks call that orientation is phronesis. And all these animals have it, but people don't. We can orient towards anything, good or bad, right? The people in my family orient towards the bottle, among other things. And the bottle's very bad for my family. You know, probably everybody else on this call can have a bottle and it's not a problem. No, but nobody in my family can dare touch the bottle or we'll wreck our lives. We've got the bad gene. The problem is we don't have the phronesis to pull us towards the thing we ought to be pulled towards. And we'll talk about why in a moment. The second term that they have is sopron. Sopron. And sopron has to do with being conscious of your limits and keeping your head. Sopron is what all of you have with respect to alcohol, but that my family's people don't have with respect to alcohol. We lack sopron. There's not a point at which we say that's too much. You guys all get to a point where you're like, that's enough. I'm not interested in anymore. But somebody with the alcoholic gene never reaches the point where they're done. They want more forever. They lack sopron on that particular issue. So this is the combination, sopron and phronesis, both of which translate very badly into English. I have never seen a translation of either of those terms that I cared for. And they add up together to another concept, which is called soprosune. And soprosune is the most important word in the Greek language. It's the most important concept in the ancient Greek culture. And it's the key to this entire system of ideas. And soprosune is the compass in your brain that points you towards the things you should point towards and away from the things you should point away from. It is the combination of phronesis and sopron. And it is being oriented towards what's healthy for you, what's good for you. what fits you into the larger ecosystem so that you thrive and the ecosystem thrives. And all the other animals have it, and the plants have it, and the fungi have it, and the bacteria have it, and the archaea have it, but Homo sapiens does not have it. We don't have soprasune. So you just said something on mute, Sharon. Come off mute and say what that was. I really want to hear it.
I said, I think we do.
Well,
And talk about this later, because some of these characteristics, some of these things that you're outlining, like soprasune and alcohol, I don't know how much of that is character or how much of it is genetic.
genetics are part of character.
How do you separate the two?
You don't. Genetics are part of character.
Okay.
Right? Because the cheetah gets the innate, the basic cheetah character it inherits from its mom and its dad. And then the missing parts are filled in through cheetah culture, through the teaching that the cheetah mother does and that the older siblings do. And so it builds up its cheetah culture. But all of that cheetah character it comes from the genetic foundation, which is also part of ethos. So the fact that I'm born with a character that has this defect, that's part of my character. It may be genetic, but it's still part of my character that I've got the defect. So, and the problem, and there are, as Aristotle talks about at length, there are things that human beings can do to simulate soprasune if they're very careful and very good. And Homo sapiens is designed to simulate soprasune through culture, through acculturation. And we'll talk about why in a second. But what we don't have is the hardwired genetics that make it so that all human beings everywhere want to live the same lifestyle. We aren't all anesthesiologists. We aren't all fishermen. We aren't all anything. We're the variable animal. That's our stupid pet trick is we can be many different things. And a cheetah can't. A cheetah has to be a cheetah. And so one way to describe it is we're a generic animal. We're not a specific animal. And that makes it possible to complete our character. If you're going to have so much less genetic determination of what your character is, you have to compensate by having more culture to fill in the blanks that were left when the genes were pulled out. So if we don't have genes that make us obsessed with the gazelle, and we don't, then what is going to make us interested in particular foods? Well, culture, right? It's why different cultures focus on different foods. There's the people who grow corn. There's the people who are fishermen. There's the people who make hummus. There's different kinds of food and food organizing activities, and they're not taught to us genetically, but they're taught to us culturally. And that's what evolution has given us, is this variability that allows us to have different cultures that teach us to live a different bios, a different way of life, based on a different collection of zoe. Right? We're not tied to one particular suite. And what that allows us to do that other animals can't do, to the extent that we do, is we can live anywhere, more or less, on Earth. We have a huge range of possible habitats, a huge range of possible species that we're dependent on, and different ways that we organize our lives. And it can lead us in the modern world into the illusion that we can do anything, which is absolutely not true. Because what the Greeks believe is that it remains true that most possible ways of life that we can imagine don't work, right? We see cultures fail all the time, and modern culture might be failing right now, for example, right? And it's a way of life, but it's not a way of life that works. It's a way of life that only works for a few decades or a few centuries, and then it uses up its environment. That is to say, when we look at the plummeting number of wild animals in the world, the plummeting number of old growth trees, the plummeting amount of fresh water, then what we see is that the zoe, the parts of the world that are necessary to sustain our life, are being harmed by the way that we're living our life. And that means that the way that we're living is not a true bios. And our behavior are not true ethea. And the excellences that we're cultivating, such as cutting corners and throwing pollution somewhere and making it somebody else's problem, those aren't real arete. No matter how good you get at ripping apart somebody else's company and selling it off for money and making a quick profit, that's not an arete. It's not an excellence in the Greek sense. The word arete doesn't just mean you're good at something, but that the thing that you're good at is good for you. It's an ingredient in an eteia, which leads to a bios, which leads to a harmony of your species with the larger world. So if the excellence doesn't do that, then excellence isn't an arete, which is why we can't define arete as excellence. Although we do. That's how moderns define arete. And in so doing, we completely misunderstand the point of what Aristotle's talking about. His point is sophrosune. All of these things are to point us to sophrosune. So if our culture teaches us how to live a sustainable life, then it is simulating the sophrosune that the animals have culturally. And that's what you were talking about. We can learn to care about things. You can learn to live the life of an anesthesiologist and develop the specific arete that make it possible. And thereby develop the behaviors, the eteia, that creates a livelihood, a bios, based on the zoe. And this is, boy, isn't this the modern world? The zoe of substances that allow you to knock people out and keep them under at exactly the right level of unconsciousness, that it doesn't harm them, but it keeps them from feeling the pain so that they can be operated upon. It's a very unusual kind of zoe. You can't see a cheetah doing it. You can't see a whale doing it. You can't see any other kind of animal doing it. It's the kind of thing people can do. And it could be sustainable in a larger, sustainable context. So,
could I take a moment to ask a question?
Please.
It's very relevant. I want to ask about ethos as it relates to phronesis and sophron. I was
Yes.
thinking ethos is, again, you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm reading your definitions, but also thinking about them for a while, reflecting. The ethos is like one's inner disposition, your inner predisposition to certain things, meaning like I have this proclivity to really enjoy tennis, but I really hate baseball, right? So
Mhm.
my ethos would be towards tennis and away from baseball. And those are totally neutral. It doesn't matter, like they're arbitrary. But in the case of phronesis and sophron, for some reason, let's say tennis was going to be really good at bringing, I don't know, a healthier, more environment, like an actual excellence to like an arete to things, and baseball would be bad for some reason, that I would, in this case, my phronesis would know that I should be going towards tennis, and my sophron should be like, no, you should stay away from baseball.
Right.
Is that a relatively good
Yeah.
analogy?
Yeah. Yeah. If under the conditions you described, that's how phronesis and sophron would work. And an example I used 4 months ago when we were talking about this was the life of a fisherman, which is very different from the life of a reindeer herder. You have to develop, for example, you have to develop amazing skills at knots. You have to be very good at tying and untying knots because you got to make nets, you got to make fishing lines, there's all kinds of things you have to knot up correctly to live the life of a fisherman. And if you have no interest in paying attention to the right way and the wrong way to tie a knot, you have no business being a fisherman. You simply can't live that way of life. I mean, you might briefly, but then you'll die because one of your knots will slip and you'll fall overboard and you're dead, in the frozen Arctic waters.
Would you mind if I ask a question of using your model? Because I was thinking about something within your model describes things that the fishermen already do, but in life we like the semathecy, we have to adapt. So what if there's like this guy who's not really into fishing, but he's really into, let's say, astronomy, and somehow, as we know, that astronomy could really help you, let's say, fish at night. Let's pretend that that's really good and really could be excellent. It could be an arte, and it hasn't been cultivated yet. So in this case, that he has a natural predisposition, a natural ethos towards astronomy, that could actually be a phronesis for all of his people, that they could
Right.
then learn how to navigate better, even though they can't see it yet.
That's
And
right.
as a and okay, fine. So okay, that's what I'm
Yeah.
thinking. This is a
That's
way
right.
of how new concepts get added into things, and whether they're going to be something you should go towards or stay away from. Yeah. Okay,
That's
fine.
right.
Thank you.
That's right, Ari. And related to this is another idea. I mean, so the first thing about the bios that we really need to pin down is that most things that people might want to do now that we've been evacuated of all these instincts that would hardwire our character, the way that cheetahs are hardwired, and the way that peregrine falcons are hardwired, and so forth. All that stuff's been ripped out of us through evolution. Evolution took us on a very unusual tangent to the rest of the animal kingdom. It took us on a tangent to where we developed a whole bunch of skills for culture. and character that's obsessed. We're obsessed with language. That's why we're all here today. We're obsessed with ideas. We're obsessed with language. We're obsessed with solving problems. And all of these things evolved into us. I mean, we have a genetic predisposition to babble as little kids and to imitate what we hear and to, identify patterns and so on. And without that, it wouldn't be possible to live the life of a Homo sapiens.
Would you say that's an example of an ethos?
It's part of our ethos. It's part of our ethos.
Is ethos in this case like a noun or a verb? I'm kind of stuck on this concept.
All of these things I'm giving you are nouns, but all of these things are also related to verbs and adjectives and adverbs. Greek has this ability to turn one thing into another. So the word ethos is sort of at the center of an enormous, hundreds of terms, like ethea is on this list, but hundreds of terms are derived from ethos, including verbs and adverbs. But ethos itself is a noun. And the noun is your character. It's your inner nature, your inner character. So you have an ethos, I have an ethos, together we have an ethos. Everybody on this call together has an ethos. Homo sapiens has an ethos. A rock has an ethos, right? Light has an ethos, that's studied by physicists who study light and so forth. So it is, what is the lawfulness, the inner lawfulness that drives the behavior, through what we are aware of, what we notice and don't notice, what we care about and don't care about, what we want and don't want. All that unconscious stuff that comes before rationality, that's all down in the character. That's the Dionysian realm, the darkness inside from which our behavior emerges.
I want to ask, this leads to another, that sounds a lot like the daimon. Is daimon then the sum of your ethos? Or is it more like the living representation? Like, almost sounds like daimon is like a name or a concept to, like to say this creature that we see that has all these things, that's called a cheetah, right? We give this name, the cheetah. Is that like its daimon? That's this overarching sum of all of its everything?
I think that it's a good question. And the easiest approach for a modern is to think of the daimon as a metaphor. Is that when Heraclitus says ethos anthropoi daimon, he's saying the way to understand your character and your relationship to it is that it has a life and a personality of its own. It's not an object. It's an organism and a mind, and it wants things and it does things and it moves you. And when it does those things and you relate to it, you don't relate to it as a peer. It has authority over you like a god. That's why he uses daimon specifically. And just like Poseidon is the god of the waters and Zeus is the god of the thunderbolts, your character is like a daimon who's the god of why you do the things you do. And
to me, that sounds like a name, like what we would almost, in the simplest, over reduced, if it was a living thing, like the sum of all of the ethos, everything we call the ocean, right? The ocean is the daimon, and then the power of the ocean over you. It's like when we think of a living being and we want to relate to it, we give it a name.
Yeah. It is like naming a thing. It's partly what he's doing is he's saying you have to treat it not like a hammer, but like another person you have to negotiate with. And that person's
a living version of a hammer.
Yeah. The hammer has its own ideas about what it's going to do. And you can't just make it do what you want. You have to learn about it. And what is
Well, this is like the One Ring or something, right? The ring itself has a will of its own, right? So the hammer has a will of its own that you have to then, okay.
Yes, all that stuff. That's like Stormbringer, the Elric stories, where Stormbringer is the powerful, hero / villain, and he's got a sword that's incredibly powerful and allows him to win battles. But unfortunately for him, the sword has a mind of its own, and it's not a nice sword. It likes to kill people. It likes to suck their souls in. And, how does the series end? Well, eventually it kills him and sucks his soul in, and that's the end of the series. It is not his servant, right?
But is the daimon the sword itself or the will of the sword? Are those separable?
It gets hard to separate them. I mean, the way to think about the daimon is a metaphor for the ethos. The ethos and the daimon can be thought of as the same thing.
That's very helpful. Okay, got it.
So the ethos is your character, and we get that idea. But the reason he equates it to a daimon is to say your character is not a possession you have, and it's not a tool you have, and it's not just an object. It's a living organism that grows and learns and changes, and it has its own ideas about what it's going to do, regardless of whether you know what those ideas are or are not. And that's the reason why they put Gnothi Seauton at the entrance to the oracle at Delphi, because they're saying, if you don't know your daimon, if you haven't got to know who's in there making these choices for you, then you don't know who you are. You don't know what's going to come out of you when you're put under pressure, right? You've never got to know what's in there. So, you're going to live a life in which your capacity to have gnome, to make plans and to carry out actions in the world, is going to be severely compromised, not just by luck outside yourself, but by the unexpected events that come from inside yourself that you've never got to know. So that's why he uses daimon as the metaphor. Think of it as another mind at work. And that mind is making a lot of the choices for you before your conscious mind thinks its first thought. You go to sleep at night and your daimon's busy having dreams and stuff.
I'll be honest, it sounds like the metaphor of the ghost in the shell.
It is. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. So, and daimon as ghost makes a lot of sense. I mean, the daimon is a mind. It's a mind with a character, a specific nature. And, so they used to translate it as a spirit, but that gets tricky because spirit has all these Christian connotations that the Greeks didn't mean. So, okay. So where we are is as follows. We're saying that Homo sapiens' stupid pet trick is that evolution ate away at our frame of instincts. So we have less genetically predetermined character than other animals do. And what that does is it makes it possible for us to engage in a wider range of behaviors. We can have a wider range of, the bioi, the bios, the way of life. There can be more than one of them. We don't just have to live a single cheetah life. We don't all have to be fishermen. We can learn to do different things. But where moderns misunderstand this, which this is a very important point to the Greeks, is that doesn't mean that any given person can do anything, or that Homo sapiens can do anything, because we're still constrained by what are the zoe in the world around us that it's possible to build a life around. There aren't an infinite number of them. Only some things can serve as zoe, and those things that can serve as zoe are going to demand a certain way of life. The way of life of a fisherman is totally different from the way of life of a reindeer herder. You can't just improv your way between the two. The way of life of an anesthesiologist. Sharon had to learn an enormous amount about this way of life and how it works, and develop the habits and the practice and take an interest in the excellences of it. It makes the generic quality of Homo sapiens is only a potential as an infant. But as you grow up, you have to become a specific animal, like an anesthesiologist or a fisherman. You have to become that animal. And you can't do it unless your character, whether the one you were born with or the one that's cultivated through culture, allows you to develop the excellences and the interests and the behaviors to construct the entire way of life that's required to thrive in that bios, the bios of an anesthesiologist or the bios of a fisherman. And there may be a number of ways in which you can cross features of one with the other and still get a viable bios. Let's say there's some finite number of possibilities between those two ways of life. But mixed in with them are going to be a nigh infinite number of possibilities that are not viable. Things that are just not going to work. Right? If Sharon just can't stop tying knots and she's in an operating room, what's the opportunity for mischief in an operating room if somebody's fiddling around with all of the cords and fiddling around with all of the tubes and they just can't stop themselves? They're just relentless. Right? And if every time someone says, okay, we're having a problem with the patient, your answer is, I'm going to throw a net on them. No, don't throw the net. Don't cast a hook on a line into the patient's open abdomen. None of this is going to be helpful. Right? But if you don't have those interests as a fisherman, you're going to be a terrible fisherman. You've got to have obsessions. You've got to have things that just occur to you. And the reason they have to be obsessions is, in every way of life, sometimes you have times to think and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you have to react very quickly. An anesthesiologist knows that. You've got all these monitors and sometimes they start beeping and you have to act now. And if you act the way a med student does, where you go, let me think. I have to think back through 5 years of medical school and try to remember what is the thing that I did. It's too late. The patient's dead. You just killed the patient. You have to have the practice and the reflexes and the behavior so that when it's time to act fast, you can act fast. And the only reason that works is if you drilled it into your unconscious through practice. You have become a particular kind of animal that makes you excellent at that way of life. And there may be some adjacent ways of life that you'd be pretty good at if you learned the parts that you don't have. But there are going to be lots of other Homo sapiens ways of life for which your particular skill set is exactly wrong. You have no business doing those things. You should stay away from them. The cheetah is not going to be able to engage in one of those peregrine falcon dives and capture the pigeon and then spread out its wings and fly up before it hits the rocks. It doesn't have any wings and it doesn't think like a bird, right? It's missing all of the excellences. The excellences don't translate. So this is the core, this is the first of the two core things that comes out of this. I'm going to call on Donald in a second because I know he wants to comment on this particularly. So the first core thing is that there are not an infinite number of bioi, ways of life for Homo sapiens. None of us knows how many there are. The only thing we know for sure is that more potential ways of life that we might think of rationally or artificially don't work than do work. When you see the number of things you have to get right to be a fisherman, or the number of things you have to get right to be a fisherman, or the number of things you have to get right, reindeer herder, or the number of things you have to get right to be an anesthesiologist, that's not something you're just going to think your way to on the spur of the moment. It takes lots of culturation and lots of practice and experience to become excellent at those things. They all have to be got right to be able to live that life. Right? So Homo sapiens is an animal that is born sort of generic, but full of these longings in their character. And they somehow have to find their way to one of the culturally available ways of life and get cultivated and cultivate themselves and alter their character over time to develop the excellences that will allow them to thrive in the behaviors and live that way of life. That's what the Greeks are able to conclude about us as an animal. That moderns can't reach this conclusion. Our models, your body's a machine, your mind is a computer, food is fuel. None of that stuff prepares people. Also, you're absolutely free, you're born free, you can do anything you want. None of that prepares people for the potential for tragedy and mishap. All the ways you can go wrong by doing something you're not fit to do, by not wanting to put in the time and effort to practice and become the kind of person who can do that kind of thing, by wanting to just skip to the end. That gnome versus tuke, you mistake your success for personal prowess, and then you overreach because you think if I could do it once, then I can do it twice. And then you set sail for Sicily and you lose your entire fleet because you didn't understand how lucky you were the first time things came out the way that they did in your favor. That's what happens when you engage in things you're not excellent at. Sometimes you'll succeed by luck, and that will tempt you into overreaching. All right, I'm going to pause here so Donald can say something because I know he wants to talk about this. Come off mute, Donald.
Well, I wanted to back up a level. I wanted to go back to one of the first things that we got from Kenneth. That is, philosophy is either existentialist or escapist. Because philosophy is that way largely, not largely, entirely because life is that way. Life is existentialist, where, we've talked, people have brought in, there's multiple sources, but a lot of people like Heidegger, you're thrown into the world, or Hannah Arendt picks that up. It's you're thrown or pushed in or whatever. And some existentialists or people who accept existentialism as, yes, life is existential, say it's then a matter of will. It's a matter of self-creation. And I think here's where we see a rejection of that view, or in that, and what's different and I think in Kenneth's thought, and he is taking that largely from what you summed up from Greek thought, is that yes, it's existentialist. We exist, but as we exist, we're an organism, and we discover the arche that guide our own organism to its telos or whatever. But that's basically the Greek know thyself. What your task is once you exist is knowing yourself. And what you find is you do have an essence. So it's not a choice between essentialism and existentialism. Essential beings come to know that about themselves because they exist, not because like a gazelle they have preordained knowledge put in them, especially for human beings. We have to learn about ourselves. It's sort of it's not only as lifelike philosophy. Life compels us, if we are to develop sophrosune, to be philosophical. So we're doomed to be philosophers, whether we want to or not. I guess you've summed up the Greek viewpoint and the interconnectedness of their ideas so well. I just wanted to sort of say, where does this fit into philosophy? Well, and it might well be that the medievals, in trying to know themselves, revealed something about human beings
Yes.
that's valid and unknown to the ancients, or that the ancients missed.
Yes.
I mean, and that's not to say that everything they learned is false because they didn't just rediscover pagan antiquity, and it'll be the same for modernity. Modernity won't be just some total cock-up. It'll be another attempt for us to know ourselves.
Yes.
And what we find out, but we'll try to be philosophical. Well, modernity won't be, but the members of this group will be, and be able to think, well, how does our understanding compare and contrast with the medieval understanding of ourselves and the ancient understanding of ourselves? So that, as you quote Kenneth so many times, we'll have something else to think with.
Yes. Thanks for
Okay,
bringing that in,
that's
Donald.
enough.
Thanks for bringing that in, because you're right. This is all directly relevant. Directly relevant. So 4 months ago, when we covered this, we then finished with another module that I'm not going to go into right now. And that module of topics is about the clan and the tribe and the polis and their relationships to this. And the shorthand sketch is each bios or way of life corresponds originally to a clan. And you can imagine a stage of history at which clans had to be self-sufficient. But we evolved a new cultural structure called the tribe. And the tribe was an astonishing breakthrough. Moderns like to look down on tribes, but tribes are brilliant, because what tribes let you do is they let you put more than one bios together so that they can reinforce each other. And now the tribe as a whole, as a result, can have a subset of the tribe that pursues a way of life that never could have stood alone on its own as a sufficient way of life. But supported by the other ways of life that make up the tribe, it can now enrich them all. So you can have an anesthesiologist in a tribe, but you could not have if you were a standalone people. If all you ever did was anesthesia, who's going to grow your food? I mean, it doesn't work. right? As a way of, and who's going to make your clothes? It doesn't work as a way of life. But if the clan of anesthesiologists who train each other and set their practices and train the new and young to become anesthesiologists, if they're paired up with other doctors and with farmers and with fishermen and you can create a tribe that can benefit from anesthesiology as a way of life, which you never could have had when clans were all separate from each other. The tribe is a brilliant innovation. You don't just have diversity, you now have synergy where they're reinforcing each other, and it allows for greater specialization. It's a huge breakthrough. What the Greeks were most proud of is that they did the breakthrough after that. And the breakthrough after that is the polis. And what makes the polis unique is that in the polis, multiple tribes come together and agree to work together for the good of the polis, right? And so now you have something more cosmopolitan than the tribe. And the tribe itself was already more cosmopolitan than the clan.
Is
So-
the polis just the tribe of tribes?
Kind of. It's a very complicated subject. But think of it as a city-state made up of different tribes, where you can also have other city-states that have members of those same tribes. So they're kind of like focal. It's kind of a urban-rural focal points that cross tribal boundaries, and they bring together different traditions, not just different ways of life, but different religious ideas, different political ideas, and so forth. It allows for a new level of ferment. But I'm not really going to dig into that hard today, because we covered that 4 months ago, and it's not the thing that we missed. And it's the thing that we missed that's going to set us up for the medieval critique of the ancients. So here's the thing that we missed, that we didn't do. Think of everything we've talked about as the larger context for understanding what the Greeks mean by ethos. What is character? A character is not a simple dictionary definition. It's part of this whole framework that has to do with how all things on Earth live. They all have characters. Every species has a character. And Homo sapiens is the species that has the capacity for radically different characters within the same species, right? Some things we share in common, like our diction to language and problem solving and ideas, and other things are wildly different among us. So having established that, what Aeschylus and Thucydides and Cornford are next talking about is, if you are trying to act in the world with the character that you have at the moment, what should you be on guard against? Right? What should you be careful about? And based on that, they critiqued civilizations on the following basis. They said, there are these two things that they called xuntukiai, which related to luck. Two guises in which luck reveals itself, contingency expresses itself in the world. And one way of thinking about it is that one guise is good luck and one guise is bad luck, right? Something could happen that was much better than you expected to happen. Something else could happen that was much worse than you expected to happen. But they said that's trivial. That's not the level that they're interested in. What they're interested in is these predispositions caused by fortune that can seriously affect your character. And the two predispositions they cared about were penia and plotos. And penia is grinding poverty. We're not talking about not quite having enough. We're not talking about envying the Joneses for having a nicer Cadillac than yours. We're talking about you frequently don't have enough food to eat. You're frequently cold. You're sick a lot. You're just being ground down by how much below a living wage you're making, how much below your basic needs are being met. The Greeks said, when that happens, it does terrible things to your character. You could have been born with the luckiest character in the world with all the gifts. But if fortune throws you into the circumstance of penia, penia is going to ruin your character. It'd be extraordinarily difficult. It's just not fair to tell somebody born into grinding poverty that they should just, suck it up and work harder. Grinding poverty is the definition of the level at which sucking it up doesn't help. It's too bad. You spend all your time in crisis. And the Greeks said, a society that creates conditions of penia is a society that's wrecking itself. Bad things are going to happen as a result of that. Not just for the individual, but for everybody around them. It's like having a nuke somewhere in the city that's going to go off at a random interval. It's that bad, right? And the second xuntukia is plotos. And that's not somebody's richer than somebody else, they have a nicer Cadillac, they have 2 houses instead of 1. That is unbelievable levels of wealth that mean that somebody never has to think. They can always throw money at the problem. This is what Nietzsche warns us about when he says power makes stupid. He's not saying nobody should have everyone should be powerless. He's saying when you have excessive levels of power, your sympathecy depletes. And I'm going to come back to that with Penny in a moment too. Your sympathecy depletes. You stop paying attention to the actual details of the world around you because the solution to every problem is the same. You just throw more money at it. No, just throw more money at it. It's like the tyrant who has a very strong guard. And he just sends them around the city to beat up anybody who criticizes him. Sure, some of the criticism's invalid, but some of it's valid. And if he would listen to it, he would be a better ruler and make a better city-state. But he doesn't have to because he's got the bullies to go beat the guy up and shut them up. His power makes him stupid because it impedes his sympathecy. It cuts off his access to the new information coming from the world around him. As a result, his own character stops being alive to the circumstances around him, and he stops growing and adapting in the way that a genuinely living character would. He starts to become more like a rock than like a person. And it becomes a problem because he's spreading the consequences of his stupid actions all over the place. His vices are magnified by his power along with his virtues, and the consequences of the vices are felt everywhere. So let's talk about, just for a moment, Penia in terms of sympathecy too. Grinding poverty is the level at which you are in so much crisis that you don't have the time or resources it takes to sustain sympathecy. You can't be alive to all the things going on around you because you're on fire. It's the equivalent of being on fire. You can't engage in rational debate when you're on fire. You can't plant a garden when you're on fire. You can't take the steps that would make your life better. You can't cultivate your character because you're perpetually in crisis over the basics. That's the level that grinding poverty is at. So the Greek critique, and Aristotle talks about this, Aristotle's discussion of the different forms of government and the good ones and the bad ones is partially predicated on this idea of sophrosune. Without sympathecy, right, people can't learn to simulate sophrosune. And when people act without sophrosune, they become a menace. They become dangerous because now they're not acting for what's healthy. It's just erratic. They become, instead of a cosmos, a force, a centripetal force, like Stephen used to talk about, they become a centrifugal force. If things fly apart because they're under so much pressure that they can't adapt and weave the society back together. They themselves become a danger, right? They're starving, they're desperate. They'll do things that they wouldn't do. Same with the people who are too rich, and we see this in the Roman Empire. The people who are too rich and powerful, they do things that a healthy person would never do. Heliogabalus dropping a huge amount of rose petals on his diners, only there are too many, and a bunch of his diners suffocate and die. This is not healthy behavior. I mean, he may be getting the talk of the town, and everybody's talking about Heliogabalus's amazing parties, but that's not actually healthy for him, for the diners who died, or for the civilization that's squandering all these resources, dropping rose petals and suffocating their diners, when they should be making sure that nobody's living in Penia, that people are raised to a minimum that allows them to thrive and do good for the world around them. So we'll come back to that. But first, I wanted to introduce these two terms. Sharon, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Just going back a couple of about 10 or 15 minutes, you said the things we left out the last time.
Yes.
The bios and what was the second one?
Penia and Plotos.
Penia and the Plotos. No, that's not it. You said the last time we had this discussion, we did not mention a third part, and it had to do with the polis.
Oh, I said last time we did do the third part, but I was going to skip it this time. So
Yes.
Last part was the clan, the tribe, and the polis.
The clan, the tribe, and the polis. Yes.
Did you cover before Zoe? I feel like that's new as well.
Well, Zoe and Bios are both new this time. I discovered them in the intervening months.
Yeah, when I think you were talking about the two things, you said Bios. I think the other one you were looking for is Zoe.
Zoe. Okay, the clan, the tribe, the polis, and Zoe.
The
Okay,
clan, the tribe, and the polis. The clan, the tribe, and
and the tribe and the polis. Okay,
the why they did their political economy the way they did was built off these concepts of ethos that we talked about today. The clan, the tribe, and the polis are all derived from ethos and atheia and bios and all that.
they're all derived from the characteristics.
Yeah.
But there's other one other observation that keeps flitting around in my mind. Character helps us develop worth, and worth takes us into values. And
Yes.
even the polis acts on a certain set of values.
Yeah.
Societies have common values which dictate how they distribute the wealth among all its citizens.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And that's the character. And so all these components of character add up to a kind of commonality, which is what I talked about, an admirable life and an enviable life, because I like something that I can relate to through all these Greek definitions.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, the Greeks interestingly documented their struggles to get above the level of the tribe, to try to make something bigger than a tribe. They wrote about how hard they worked at it. They wrote about the history of changes to their constitution to try to support the idea of something bigger than the tribe. I mean, they were really proud of the polis. Yeah, they had fought hard to create this larger form of society that had never existed among the Greeks before.
Yes, but the value of the tribe and the polis came from the way they set up their society. Came from the way that their characters were among themselves, in essence.
Yes.
Am I getting that right?
Yes. Yes. And of course, part of the challenge of the tribe and the polis is that in a clan where you're all living the same way of life, you can, in theory, all have very similar characters, which might, if they're healthy, harmonizing characters gives you the opportunity to live well together. But as soon as you start mixing different clans together, you've got a problem, because the things that the anesthesiologist thinks are important are different from the things that the fisherman thinks are important. So how are you going to make decisions about what you should do next? You can't agree on that. So figuring out how to get clans to work in a tribe was a real tough challenge. And it was based on how do you get very different characters to coexist with each other in a harmonizing way. That was the challenge to create a tribe.
Yeah, because of the different value systems.
Yes, which come right out of the character.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, the whole value system is essentially intrinsic in the character, because the character is what's determining what you notice, what you care about, what you act on. And so that's what a value system does, is it defines those things. So the value system comes right out of character. And so if you've got different characters, you've got different value systems, and now how do you make a decision? There's a huge political implication, from trying to make a tribe out of clans.
So the resulting value system is foundational to the operation of the society, or to the operation of the individual.
It is. Yes. And all the stuff that we've talked about before about how the Greeks cultivated their own religion, they wove together a bunch of separate tribal religions to create the Olympian religion. And then they mandated, this is going to be our shared religion that's going to bind us together. This was all part of trying to get above the level of the tribe to the level of the polis, and eventually to the level of getting all the Hellenic speakers to work together, like to fight the Persians. It all depended upon the creation of the Olympic Games and the shared epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and the practice of the storytelling. All these things were about trying to, underneath the different value systems of the different clans and tribes, they're trying to create a shared value system that could hold them all, like a cradle, for all the different babies. It was this is what you're talking about. This is what they worked so hard at.
But in the medieval time here, when they started to adopt Christianity was not so kind, for want of a better word. It was pretty heavy-handed. And it had a value system which was dictatorial, because the main goal was political. So that's a very different take on it, the way I am seeing it evolve.
It is, but part of the reason I'm introducing this is now that we see this thing about Penia and Plotos, and I'm going to leave off the last thing because we're out of time. The last thing is optional, and that is the Greeks then went and tried to make a catalog of all the different daimons that could bring badness to you, all the different ways your character could go wrong. And they tried to link them to Penia and Plautos and other things to say, what are the predispositions to make people make these mistakes? But let's set that aside for the moment. Right here with Penia and Plautos, we have what we need to see the medieval critique of the ancient world, which is, you promised you would avoid Penia and Plautos because that would wreck human character. And if you wreck human character, tragedy will surely follow. And we all want to avoid the worst, outcomes for Homo sapiens. But what you gave us was the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire maximized Plautos and Penia. It created divides the world had never seen before, in which the normal, healthy lifestyle became the exception, and grinding poverty and horrendous levels of extreme wealth became the norm. And under those circumstances, they were betraying the whole promise of the nature-driven, character-driven approach to making political economies. They're saying, by your own standards, Rome, you have betrayed everything you stood for. Somebody needs to come along and fix this and make it so that as few people as possible end up there. Can be poor people, but not people in Penia. And there can be rich people, but not people in Plotos, because those are character wreckers. We need a new way of life in which it's not possible to have Penia or Plotos. There can still be diversity, but there can't be those extremes that wreck character, because that's how you wreck a civilization. That's the medieval critique of ancient Rome. And by extension, it's also their critique of the less corrupt earlier forms of the ancient world, because they say what you did led inevitably, eventually, to the Roman Empire. I mean, maybe you were better in Athens and Sparta and Corinth and elsewhere before a certain point, but somehow you devolved to the point where Athens wanted to be an empire, and you began to have Penia and Plautos. And look what it did. You wrecked yourselves. So there is a path that leads from the golden age of the ancient world through the decay into Rome. And somehow the ancients weren't able to figure out why it happened to them and how to stop it. And the medievals said, well, we think we know what went wrong, and we think we know how to stop it, which is more than you can say, oh, ancients. So this is the value proposition. Can you fix this thing that went so badly wrong with Rome? You can see how this could be a compelling argument. I mean, after centuries of frustration and despair and sort of giving up on hope that was existing in the late Roman Empire, you could see how somebody coming along with a message that actually we know where it went wrong and we know how to fix it, that would be very appealing to get out of the fatalism and to have a way forward.
Thank you.
My pleasure. So Phil, come off mute and add what you've been waiting all this time to say.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that seems to trace this, but it might be in different words. I'm going to start with the Garden of Eden, which really characterizes because we don't have this sort of instinct, but we have this sort of free will. We human beings live east of Eden. And so therefore we develop a structure that eventually separated us from nature and in a sense created an eco-cycle of our own, which is culture. And it seems to me that a lot of that just arise out of evolution in a way, from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic. And the Neolithic demanded, in a sense, the development of this sort of garden east of Eden. Let's put it that way. Okay? And I was thinking throughout whether Plato was moving beyond that in creating, and I wonder whether Plato was not the first modernist, or at least a proto-modernist, Uh, and it came to me, it has something to do with Marshall McLuhan, of course, which came much later, which sort of said the medium is the message, not the thing itself. The concepts is the message, whatever the medium is. And of course, that was a time when language became very prominent, you know. In fact, Plato wrote it down rather than just talking about it. And so language became a very, very important part that, in a sense, was the medium, that, in a sense, was the common structure of this new ecology. So there's now two ecologies in some sense. And I wonder whether this was not something that created, yeah, and it's often maybe said that Plato was the beginning of metaphysics because it created a kind of a sort of rational structure, which a language is. And in some sense, it began to erode away the mytho culture, which is sort of like a deeper sort of psychological condition. But now psychological condition could be explained much more in the mechanical process itself. I, uh, this to me actually, then you have Hegel, who actually explained this sort of evolution of culture itself, that it was not just still, but it evolved not out of the strict control of language, but evolved in a true ecology that, in a sense, uh, engender itself and it allows for transformation. And it seems to me when you go through these epochs of evolution, in which the culture, on the one hand, at some point created stability because there was enough openness to develop further, and at some point it became constrained, and the rules and the structure became very stiff, and the formal structure began to constrain the development of the ecology. And so Hegel sort of explained it's gotten to a point where, in a sense, uh, Minerva, the owl of Minerva, takes flight at dusk, right? In other words, we become so comfortable in this sort of static structure that's pretty stable because we love stability, but we also love openness in some sense. There's tension. And when the closure became so stable, in a sense, it became consolidated to the point there's no wiggle room. And it really led me to Bob Dylan, you know? Of course, I grew up when I went to Berkeley. I fell in love with Bob Dylan because he was, in many ways, trying to go back to a much more poetic way of expressing something deeper than, in a sense. And so everybody could feel like, he was part of the revolution. And his relation of Joan Baez was very interesting because Joan Baez was also critical of the social structure. But she existed within a certain you could say sub-tribe of a larger polis in some sense. And so there was a tension in which he felt, because he started out as a folk singer, but nonetheless, he decided to need to move on because he felt constrained by this subculture itself, which also was partly constrained by the whole culture. So there was a lot of tension between Joan Baez and Bob Dylan. And I think in 1965, they broke up. Although they performed together, uh, she held a lot of grudge against him because he walked away from the criticism because he thought it was too constraining. He had to criticize things in a much more different way. So to me, he was saying something that was very, very important, but he seemed to be reveling in a groundless ground, which allow for the subconscious to arise in a poetic form. And later in her life, so there's many, many years, I think just maybe within the last 5 years, she hit a personal resolution. What she did was she always appreciated that he was saying something very profound and deep. She decided to, because she's also a reasonable painter, not a great painter, but a pretty good painter. She was painting portraits, but she decided to paint Bob Dylan. In order to make it more authentic, she decided to play all of the albums of Bob Dylan, so she would be in the atmosphere of that. And when we get in the paint, after a while, she started crying relentlessly. And because she realized he was right, not that she was wrong, but he was right. Because everything he said, I think she knew that everything he said was true, even though he went off the deep end, let's put it that way. But in some sense, I think that was a signal, at least in my generation, and it still is. I think that was Minerva taking flight in a very chaotic period. And he was a voice. I came to this, I began watching a lot of videos about this period because I went to the movie called A Complete Unknown, which is the new film of Bob Dylan. A very, very wonderful film, actually. I highly recommend it.
Complete Unknown?
A complete uh a complete unknown, yes. Which was what Bob Dylan was. And then he just like within a year, he became the most important musician probably in the world. And so in some sense, I think that may be the revolution we're still in the fourth turning, so to speak. And I think that's because chaos is now finally into the structure. And it's just very interesting that I guess after the First and Second World War and then a period of stability, and certainly in my generation, the evolution of the beatniks into the hippies and all that kind of stuff was really a part of the expression. And everybody, all the young people really gathered to that in some sense. And Bob Dylan was in the background of it. And so it's important to know that when I went to college, I only had two posters in my room. One was Bob Dylan, the other was Malcolm X.
Ah, yes.
Yes.
Nice.
So I think they were saying something about the injustices of society at that time. So I think that's what I want to say is like the breakdown of the second evolution environment.
Yeah.
Because we are now beginning to understand that it's not just the second eco-cycle and coexisting with the cosmic or the nature eco-cycle. We have become so dominant that we have destroyed the other eco-cycle.
Right.
In other words, for instance, if you're a rhinoceros or you're a leopard or you're
Yes.
a bear, you only have one choice: live in the zoo
Yes.
or die.
Yes.
I mean,
viable.
that's the problem what we have is that we not only coexisted for a long time with this first ecology, but we have become so dominant that we have actually destroyed the first ecocycle.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm
So-
sorry I spent so long today doing my summary. I didn't give people enough time to talk, and next time we'll have the usual balance so that everyone gets a chance, because I know there's a lot of material. And
I want to ask real fast. We didn't get to talk about Martin Luther King at all. Could we pretend maybe next week? Could we save a little bit for him? Because
Sure.
I think you prepared some stuff. I also
Yes.
prepared something. I think it's due honoring his greatness.
Yeah.
Sure, I'd love
It's
to.
interesting that
You
I
can
do
look
not
up
have.
his quotes. Look
But
up
it's
Martin
interesting that I
Luther.
do not have his picture on my wall. I had Malcolm X.
Yeah.
Which quotes? Which ones are you referring to, Stephen?
Oh, you just look up, famous quotes of Martin Luther King. But of course, Malcolm X is my absolute favorite when he said, the more dangerous white people are the liberals. The conservatives, they show you who they are. They show you they're a wolf. But watch out for those liberals. They're a fox. They sneak up to you, then they bite you.
That's the letter from the Birmingham jail. Yeah, it's a powerful work. Yeah, Ari, I think that's a great idea. So next
And maybe
time,
Stephen, you would also talk about Malcolm X too. I think he's worth, it just I think feel like today what it was beautiful what you said, Rick, but I feel strongly, and it's okay if it doesn't go this way, but I'd really like to honor and maybe so next week we could pretend it's a little extension of this.
yes.
By the way, I drew the line. I did not like Elwood Cleaver. I did not like him. So, like, although he seemed to be in the same circle in some sense, he seemed too different to me. So I did not like Soul on Ice.
Yeah, I think this sets us up well for next week, because this gives us the material to talk about how would you evaluate people's character in the way that MLK thinks that we should be doing. So yeah, let's do that. Let's do that next week.
All right, thanks everybody. See you next week. Have a great week.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Okay,
everyone.
bye. Thank you, Rick. Thank you very much.